The sky does not forgive. A woman kneels in the middle of a dusty street, hands bound behind her back, blood still seeping through the bullet wound in her calf. A crowd stands in a tight circle, silent. Only the dry wind and the held breath of 50 people waiting. The cold barrel of a rifle presses against her forehead. She does not beg, does not look at the crowd. She only looks straight at the man holding the gun, then slowly closes her eyes. Certain he will pull the trigger. 1 second. 2. The rifle does not fire. Instead, the sharp sound of a knife-cutting rope cuts through the street. A heavy leather coat drops over her shoulders, and a low, clear voice carries across the entire town. This woman is under my protection. Absolute silence. Then the whole town begins to go still. 3 days before the whole town went quiet. The Arizona sky doesn't forgive anybody. Not the cattle. Not the land. Not a man like Holt Calder, 36 years old, alone on 40 acres that used to belong to somebody's dream and now just belonged to him. Folks in Ashford Hollow had their own tidy version of who he was. Quiet man, fair trader. Kept to himself since he'd mustered out of the army 8 years back and bought this scrap of ground nobody else wanted, out past the last decent water. Some said he'd seen things during his scouting years that soured him on company. Others said he just preferred cattle to people, and who could blame him? Cattle didn't lie. Nobody in that tidy version knew the real reason he slept light, knew about the years he'd spent riding ahead of a column, reading dust and smoke for a living, deciding in half a second what to report and what to leave unsaid. That part of him he kept buried the way a man keeps buried whatever he can't afford to look at twice. The ranch itself sat low in a shallow basin, ringed by scrub and rock the color of old rust, the kind of country that looked hostile to a stranger's eye and looked, to Holt, simply like home. Mornings out here started the same particular gray, sky and dirt nearly the same shade, until the sun finally cleared the eastern ridge and set the whole basin blazing gold for the few honest minutes before the heat took over the day entirely. He'd learned to love that window of gray into gold more than almost anything else this life had left him. The one part of each day that still felt entirely, uncomplicatedly his. He'd been out since before light. Fence line needed mending on the east ridge. Again, because that's what land does. When nobody's helping you hold it together, it falls apart in small pieces. A post here, a wire there. Until one morning you look up and the whole thing's leaning like it's tired of standing. Holt was tired too. He just didn't say it out loud. Hadn't said much out loud in years. He heard the horse before he saw the blood. Not his horse. Somebody else's, and running wrong, favoring a leg, crashing through mesquite like it didn't know which direction was safety anymore. Holt dropped the wire cutters, pulled his rifle off the fence post where he'd leaned it out of habit, not fear. Then he heard the second sound. Breathing. Ragged. Close. He followed it into the brush along the dry wash, and that's where he found her. A woman. Apache. He could tell that much fast, the way you tell a hawk from a buzzard even at a distance, something in the shape of her stillness. Except she wasn't still by choice. She was pressed flat against a boulder with her leg bent wrong underneath her, blood-soaked dark through the buckskin at her calf, and a knife already up in her hand before Holt's boot even finished its second step. She didn't scream, didn't beg, just watched him, steady, like she'd already decided how this was going to end and was only waiting to see if he'd prove her right. Easy, Holt said. Low. The way you'd talk to a spooked animal, except he knew better than to think of her that way, and some part of him flinched at his own choice of tone. She said nothing, knife didn't move, because he could see it now. The wound wasn't from a fall, wasn't from brush or rock. It was a bullet graze, clean enough to have missed the bone, deep enough to have taken half a day's strength with it. Somebody had been shooting at her, recently, which meant somebody was probably still looking. Holt crouched, slow, rifle down, barrel toward the dirt, hands where she could see them empty. "I'm not one of them," he said. Her eyes flicked to the rifle, then to his face, held there. "Doesn't matter what you are," she said. English, careful edges, rounded by another language underneath it. Matters what you do next. Fair. He couldn't argue that. So he didn't. He tore a strip from his own shirt sleeve instead, held it out, and let her take it herself, rather than reach for her leg uninvited. She wrapped the wound tight, jaw locked against the pain, never once making a sound that wasn't necessary. He respected that, more than he expected to. "There's men behind me," she said finally, flat, like she was reporting weather. "Kane's men." Kane. Holt's stomach dropped an inch, because that name meant something in this territory. Garrett Voss's men. Everybody called them Kane's crew, on account of the foreman who ran the day-to-day riding. And if Kane's men were chasing an Apache woman through open range with rifles, that wasn't a cattle dispute. That was something bigger. And bigger things had a way of landing on whoever stood closest. "They'll be at your fence line by sundown," she said. "If they think you helped me, they burn what you got, and ask questions after. They can try." She almost smiled. Almost. Everybody says that, before. Before what? Before they learn how little that kind of courage costs a man like Voss to answer. He should have left her there. That was the smart version of this story. The one where a lone rancher minds his own dirt and doesn't invite trouble that isn't his. Except Smart had never once made Holt Calder feel like he could sleep at night, and he was so damn tired of not sleeping. So he helped her onto his horse instead of hers, since hers wasn't going anywhere fast on that leg, and started walking them both back toward town. Because the nearest doctor was there. Because the nearest law was there too, for whatever that was worth these days. And because some old habit from his scouting years wouldn't let him leave an injury untreated when he had the means to fix it, she didn't fight him. Didn't relax either. Sat that horse like a woman memorizing every possible direction to run. They hadn't gone half a mile before Holt spotted the first sign that Kane's men hadn't given up the chase. Fresh boot prints crossing the wash. 3 sets, heading the same direction they were, moving fast and careless the way men move when they're confident nobody's going to make them answer for it. He steered them wide of the tracks, kept the woman low against his shoulder, kept his own voice down to almost nothing. "They're close," he said. "I know." "How do you know?" "Because I've been running from them since Tuesday, and men like that don't stop running until somebody makes them." They cut through a stand of cottonwood instead of the open flat, slower going but safer, and for a stretch of maybe 20 minutes, neither of them said a word, both of them listening past the sound of their own breathing for hoof beats that never quite arrived. 2 miles in, she spoke again. "If you take me there," she said, "they will hang me before sundown." Holt didn't answer right away. Couldn't, honestly. Because some part of him already knew she wasn't wrong, and another part of him was still telling himself Ashford Hollow wasn't that kind of town. He'd find out soon enough which part was lying to him. The walk into Ashford Hollow always took the same amount of time, 40 minutes at an easy pace. Today it felt like 4 hours, every step loading something heavier onto Holt's shoulders that he couldn't name yet. She rode silent behind him now, wrists loosely bound, not because he thought she'd run. Where would she run, on that leg in this heat, but because a rancher walking an unbound Apache woman into town during a land dispute. This ugly was a rancher inviting a bullet before he could explain himself. He hated that logic. Used it any. Word travels faster than horses in a town that small. By the time the two of them crested the last rise before Main Street, there were already people standing outside the Mercantile. Outside the saloon. A cluster by the sheriff's office that thickened the closer Holt got, like flies finding blood. Sheriff Dunmore was already on the porch, arms crossed, face doing that particular kind of neutral that isn't neutral at all. It's just waiting to see which way is safer to lean. "Well," Dunmore said. "Didn't expect you to bring one home," Calder. "Found her hurt. Figured Doc could. Figured wrong." That voice came from behind the crowd, and the crowd parted for it the way crowds do for money. Garrett Voss stepped out from the shade of the Mercantile awning like he'd been waiting there all morning. For exactly this, tall, unhurried. The kind of calm that only comes from a man who's never once had to worry what happens if a room turns against him. Because it never does. Not in this town, not yet. "That's the one," Voss said, almost pleasant about it. "The one my boys have been chasing since Tuesday." "Chasing," Holt said. "Not talking to, chasing. She's dangerous," Calder. "She's shot. She's Apache." There it was, said plain, in front of God and the whole street, like that single word answered every question a person could possibly have. Holt felt something tighten behind his ribs. Old and familiar. The same tightness he used to feel right before a scouting report he knew was going to get somebody killed no matter which way he wrote it. He looked out over the crowd. Recognized most of them. Ferris from the feed store, who'd carried Holt's grain on credit through 2 bad seasons, without ever once mentioning it. The Kessler boy, 17 now, who Holt had pulled out of a flash flood 3 summers back. Old Mrs. Pratt, who baked a pie for every family in town when somebody died, and had baked one for Holt the year his own mother passed, though he'd never once asked her to. Good people. or people he'd have called good, right up until this morning, watching them lean forward now with the particular hunger of a crowd that's found something to be afraid of together. "Bring her down," Dunmore said. Not unkind exactly. Just tired and looking for the fastest way through an afternoon he clearly hadn't planned for. "We'll do this proper. Territorial judge is expected through in a week or two anyway." "A week," Holt repeated. "Give or take." Except everyone standing on that street already knew a week wasn't the plan. Voss's men were already forming a loose half-circle. Somebody near the saloon door had a rope over his shoulder, coiled, casual, like he'd brought it along for fence work, and just happened to be standing here instead. Holt looked at that rope for exactly 1 second too long, which is how he knew, before anyone said it out loud, that nobody in this crowd was waiting for any judge. They pulled her down off the horse rougher than they needed to. Somebody shoved her to her knees in the dirt in front of the sheriff's office, and the crowd, 40 people, maybe 50, folks Holt had traded with, prayed beside, buried children next to pressed in tighter, hungrier, like the whole town had been saving up a year's worth of fear and finally found somewhere to spend it. "String her up," a voice called from the back. Somebody Holt didn't recognize. Didn't matter. There were 3 more voices agreeing before the first one finished. Sula, because that was the name she'd finally given him, low on the ride in, like she wanted at least one person to know it, before whatever happened next happened. Sula didn't cry out, didn't struggle against the men holding her shoulders down. She just looked for Holt, found him, held his eyes the way she'd held that knife back in the wash. Steady. Already decided how this was going to end. Except this time Holt was the one holding the answer, because Dunmore, looking for the cheapest way to keep the peace, had put his own rifle in Holt's hands. "You found her," Dunmore said. Quiet, just between the two of them, but loud enough that the front of the crowd caught it too. "Town'll take it easier from you than from Kane's boys. Prove where you stand, Calder. Prove where you stand." Holt looked down at the rifle, looked at Sula, kneeling in the dirt, chin up, refusing to give the crowd the satisfaction of watching her look away first. Because here's the thing nobody in that crowd knew. Nobody except maybe Holt himself, and even he hadn't fully put words to it yet. Not until this exact second, staring down a rifle barrel at a woman who hadn't once begged. He'd stood in this position before. Different rifle, different year. A different scared face refusing to look away. And that memory hit him now like a physical blow, fast and sick. Because until this moment, he'd spent 7 years telling himself that morning in the canyon had been an isolated thing. A war thing. Something that happened once, to a younger version of him, and then got buried along with everything else he didn't talk about. Except it wasn't buried. It had just been waiting. His hands were steady. His hands were always steady. That was the curse of being good at this. The body does the job, even when the mind is screaming underneath it. The crowd went quiet the way crowds do, right before something they think they want. Sula closed her eyes. Not out of fear. Holt would understand that later, turn it over in his mind for days afterward. She closed her eyes because she'd already made her peace with this outcome 3 days ago, back in that wash, and she wasn't going to give Ashford Hollow the show of watching her lose it now at the end. 1 second. 2. The rifle didn't move, but it didn't fire either. And then Holt did the thing that would follow him around this territory for the rest of his life. The thing people would still be arguing about at church suppers a decade later. The thing that turned Garrett Voss's face the color of a bad sunset. He lowered the rifle, walked forward, knelt down in the dirt in front of her, close enough that half the crowd gasped like he'd done something obscene, and cut the rope binding her wrists with the same knife he used for fence wire. Then he stood, pulled his coat off his own shoulders, set it around hers, and said, loud enough for every last soul on that street to hear it, loud enough that there'd be no pretending later he'd meant something softer, something safer, something they could all forgive him for. "By Sunday, this woman is under my protection. Anyone who lays a hand on her answers to me." Silence. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses down on a street and makes even the horses go still. Voss's face didn't move for a long moment. When it finally did, it wasn't anger first. It was something closer to disbelief, the specific disbelief of a man who has never once had his plans interrupted by another man's conscience, and doesn't quite have the muscle memory for how to respond to it. "Calder," he said. "Careful now. Recalculating. You understand what you just did. I understand exactly what I just did. She's not yours to protect. She's not yours to kill either. Somewhere behind Voss, Sheriff Dunmore had gone very quiet, very still. A man watching two forces collide and doing careful math about which one he needed on his side by nightfall. He didn't say anything. Didn't move to stop it either. That, too, Holt would remember later. Filed it away without knowing yet how much it would matter. Ferris, from the feed store, had gone pale near the front of the crowd. The Kessler boy wasn't shouting anymore either. Something in the street had shifted, uncertain now, where its own hunger ought to point. Because right now there wasn't time to think about any of that. There was only time to get Sula up onto the horse, up behind him this time. No rope, no distance, and ride them both out of that town square under the weight of 50 pairs of eyes that had wanted a hanging and gotten a mystery instead. Somebody muttered Calder's lost his mind as they rode past, and Holt didn't correct them, didn't defend himself, didn't so much as turn his head, because he wasn't sure yet himself whether they were wrong. They hadn't cleared the last rise above town before Holt caught movement in his peripheral vision. Two riders, breaking off from the loose crowd still gathered near the sheriff's office, following, at a distance that was careful to look casual and wasn't fooling him for a second. "We've got company," he said low. Sula didn't turn to look. "How many?" "Two. Keeping their distance for now. Voss's men don't keep their distance out of courtesy. No. They keep it because they're deciding whether following is worth the risk of Great Elk's people catching wind of it before they're ready." He nudged his horse into the trees rather than the open trail, doubling back once through a dry creek bed the way he'd learned to during his scouting years, breaking a trail's line before an eye behind you could fully commit to reading it. Let's make the deciding harder on them. It worked. By the time they crested the far ridge above the cabin, the two riders had fallen back and turned around, satisfied, apparently, that they'd delivered whatever message their presence was meant to deliver, without needing to press the matter further today. "That's twice now," Sula said, once the danger had passed. "Twice you've read the ground before it turned dangerous. Habit's good for something, I suppose. It's good for keeping us both alive, Calder. Don't undersell it." They rode in silence most of the way back. The kind of silence that isn't empty, it's just full of things neither person knows how to say yet. Sula's hands rested light at his waist, more for balance than trust, he figured. Her breathing had gone shallow somewhere past the second mile, the leg wound taking its toll now that the adrenaline of almost dying had worn off and left only pain behind. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. First word since the ropes came off. "Probably not. They'll come for you now." "Not just me." "Figured that too." "Then why?" Not even a question, really. More like an accusation dressed up as woman. Long enough that she probably thought he wasn't going to answer at all. Then, because I've watched a rope go up around somebody who didn't deserve it. Once. Told myself I'd never stand close enough to let it happen again and do nothing. She didn't ask what he meant. Didn't push. But something in her posture shifted, just slightly, the wariness easing back one careful degree, like she'd filed his answer away the same way he'd filed away Dunmore's silence. Neither of them said anything else until the cabin came into view. Except his mind wouldn't quite let it rest there, wouldn't let the silence be simple the way the ride itself had been, because he kept replaying it. The rifle, the weight of it steady in his hands when everything else in him had wanted to shake. Sula's eyes closing, certain, and then the not firing, the walking forward, the knife against rope instead of trigger against flesh. What had he even been thinking? Doing that in front of 50 armed and frightened people? Nothing, probably. That was the truth of it. Hadn't been thinking at all, not in any way a sensible man would recognize as thinking. Just acting, the way his hands had once learned to act faster than his fear during those scouting years. Except this time the fast decision hadn't been about reading dust or picking a direction to report. It had been about a woman's face refusing to look away, and something in him refusing, right back to be the kind of man who could let that refusal go unanswered. Which didn't explain Voss. Didn't explain Dunmore's rifle, handed over so easy, like the sheriff had already known which way this was going to break before Holt himself did. Didn't explain any of it, really, except that some decisions aren't explained so much as arrived at, all at once, the way weather arrives, and a man's only real choice afterward is what he does once it's already raining. He was still turning all of it over when the cabin finally came into view. It wasn't much to look at, that cabin. One room and a lean-to. Timber Holt had cut and notched himself the first winter after he'd mustered out, Back when he still believed a man could build his way clear of whatever he was running from if he just kept his hands busy enough. There was a second room he'd started framing the following spring and never finished, the raw stud still standing bare against one wall like a sentence he'd lost the will to complete. He'd told himself back then that room was going to be for something. Never said what, even to himself. Some things a man builds space for without knowing yet what he's making room to hold. Sula took it all in without comment as he helped her down, her eyes moving over the unfinished framing, the well, the corral holding 6 thin cattle that were all the herd 2 bad seasons had left him. She didn't ask about any of it. He didn't offer. But he caught her gaze snag on that half-built room, a moment longer than anywhere else. And something about the way she looked at it, curious rather than pitying, made him feel less alone in owning it than he had in years. The first 3 days at the cabin passed the way careful things always pass. Slow, watched, full of small tests neither one of them called tests out loud. Holt cleaned the wound properly that first night, boiled water laid out what clean cloth he had, worked with a steadiness that surprised her. She'd admit that much later. Not gentle exactly. Careful. There's a difference, and she noticed it. She didn't thank him. Didn't apologize for flinching either. When the alcohol hit the wound and her whole leg went rigid. Under his hand, hold still, he said. Trying. Try harder, almost a joke, almost. Neither of them let it land as one, not yet. But something passed between them anyway, quick and unacknowledged, gone before either could decide what to do with it. She slept that night with a knife under the folded shirt she used as a pillow. He noticed. Said nothing. Understood it completely. Because trust isn't a door that swings open. It's a wall you take down one stone at a time, and neither of them had any intention of rushing the work. He woke the next morning to find her already sitting up, back against the wall, watching the gray light come through the one window like she'd been awake half the night, deciding whether to trust the quiet enough to sleep in it. You didn't rest, he said. Rested enough. That's not what I asked. She almost smiled at that. Tired and thin, but real. You always this stubborn about other people's business, called her. Or is it just mine? Ask me again once I've decided the answer myself. That got something closer to a real laugh out of her, short and surprised, like it had caught her off guard as much as it caught him. Days settled into a rhythm neither one planned. Holt worked the ranch, same as always, mending the fence he'd abandoned 3 days back, tending the 6 head of cattle that were all he had left after 2 bad seasons, hauling water from the well at the same hour every morning like his body had forgotten how to do it any other way. Sula watched him do all of it. From the porch, at first leg propped, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Then, as the wound allowed, from closer, following him to the well one morning without being asked, without asking permission either, simply appearing at his shoulder and taking the second bucket before he could say a word about it. You don't have to do that, he said. I know. She did it anyway. That became its kind of language between them. Neither one much for talking, both of them fluent in doing. She mended the section of fence he hadn't gotten to, found water he didn't know was there, a spring half a mile north he'd never bothered to locate because he'd always hauled from the well instead, brought in 2 rabbits from a snare line she'd rigged without asking, and left them cleaned and ready on the porch step like a question she wasn't going to voice directly. Evenings settled into their own shape too. Holt cooked plain, the way he'd cooked plain for 8 years alone, beans and cornbread and whatever the snares brought in, and the first few nights Sula ate in near silence, watching him more than the fire. By the end of the first week that had changed some, she started correcting the way he seasoned things, not unkindly, just certain, the way a person corrects something they actually care whether you get right. You're burning the fat, she told him one evening, nudging his hand off the skillet handle before he even understood what she meant to do. Low heat. Longer. Rushing it just teaches the meat to be tough out of spite. Didn't know meat held grudges. Everything holds a grudge if you treat it careless enough. She said it light, but something under it wasn't entirely a joke, and Holt heard the second meaning land, even as he let the first one pass. A few evenings after that, he caught her studying an old grazing receipt he'd left on the table, turning it over slow, her jaw set in the particular way of somebody working hard at something that wasn't coming easy. You read? He asked, careful not to make it sound like the question it partly was. Some. My mother thought it worth learning, since white men's paper decided too much about our lives for us to stay ignorant of what it said. Never had much chance to practice, though. Not living the way we've had to live this years. Want to practice now? She looked up, something guarded crossing her face before she decided visibly to set the guard down. Wouldn't turn down the help. So some evenings after that became reading evenings, Holt walking her slow through whatever paper he had lying around. Old letters, receipts, a worn almanac missing half its pages, and she picked it up faster than he expected, sharp the way she was sharp about everything, impatient with herself whenever a word tripped her up. You're better at this than you're giving yourself credit for, he told her one such evening, watching her work through a full sentence without stumbling. Easy for you to say. You've had it easy your whole life, letters just sitting there waiting for you to learn them whenever you pleased. Didn't say it was fair. Said you're good at it. She considered that, some of the frustration easing out of her shoulders. Fair point. I'll take the compliment then, since you're offering it honest. Only kind I know how to offer. Something private and pleased crossed her face at that. Quick, gone before he could be fully sure he'd seen it, and she bent back to the page with renewed patience, sounding out the next word slow and careful, like she'd decided, for tonight at least, that the letters were worth the trouble of learning properly. One evening, sitting across the fire from her, leg propped on a folded blanket, he caught her watching the work of a piece of sinew between her fingers, twisting it slow into cord. You want to ask something, she said, not looking up. Didn't say anything. Didn't have to. He almost let it drop, then didn't. What's that for? Bowstring eventually. Right now, it's just something to do with my hand so I don't spend the whole evening thinking about all the ways this could still go wrong. She glanced up, something almost wry in it. You should try it sometime, Calder. Might keep you from staring so hard. Wasn't staring. You were staring. He didn't argue that one. Instead, he asked her careful, the kind of careful a man uses when he's not sure the door's actually open yet, what her people called this stretch of country, the ridge, the wash, the mountains that turned purple every evening. She told him. Not much. A handful of words in a language he couldn't hope to hold on to after one hearing, but she said them slow, twice, and something about the patience in that felt like the first real gift either of them had given the other since the ropes came off. Doesn't sound like anything I've got for it, he admitted. You've got a name for it too. Just a duller one. That pulled something out of him that was almost a laugh. First one, in longer than he wanted to think about. She told him a little, that same evening, about her mother, careful with it the way a person is careful handling something that's still sharp on one edge. Her mother had known which plants stopped bleeding and which ones eased fever, had taught Sula the difference before she was old enough to understand why the knowing mattered so much. Her mother had also, Sula said, been the one who first taught her to watch a person's hands instead of their face, when she wanted to know what they really meant to do. Your hands are honest, Calder, she said, studying the fire instead of him. Whatever your mouth decides to say. He didn't ask what that meant exactly. Figured he'd find out one way or another, whether he wanted to or not. Fair seemed to matter to her, the giving and the taking of a thing in equal measure, and something in him understood he owed her a piece of himself back for the piece she'd just handed over. My mother's buried 2 miles east of here, he said, before he'd fully decided to say it. Died the same winter I came back from scouting. Never got to tell her most of what I'd seen out there. Not sure her I'd have known how, even if she'd lived long enough to ask. Sula watched him carefully, not pushing, just letting the door stay open at whatever width he chose to leave it. She used to bake for the whole town, he went on. Every family that lost somebody, she'd have a pie at their door within the day. Never asked, never waited to be invited. Just showed up with it, because she figured grief shouldn't have to ask permission to be tended to. He looked at the fire instead of her. When she went, half of Ashford Hollow showed up at our door, with pies of their own. More kindness in 1 week than I knew what to do with. Didn't stay in town long after that, though. Something about that kindness. Felt like it was measuring me against a version of myself I wasn't sure I could keep living up to, so you built out here instead. Alone. Seemed simpler. Was it? He considered that honestly. Maybe, for the first time. For a while. Lately, I'm not so sure simple was ever really what I wanted. Just what I thought I could manage. She didn't offer him comfort exactly. Not the easy kind. But she didn't look away either. And something about being seen plain, without flinching, without either of them rushing to soften it, felt like its own kind of gift returned for the one she'd given him first. My mother would have liked you, I think, she said finally. She had no patience for men who talked more than they meant. You don't have that particular failing. That a compliment? Rare one. Don't let it go to your head. He watched her, the way she watched him. Noted the habits. The way she stood at the tree line every evening near dusk, still, facing the mountains, for exactly as long as the light lasted, and not a minute more. Like she was keeping an appointment with something he couldn't see. He never asked what, until the sixth night, when the sky opened up into one of those sudden Arizona storms that arrive without warning and leave the same way. And Holt woke to an empty cabin and rain hammering the roof like gunfire. Her bedroll was empty. Her boots were gone. He was outside before he'd fully decided to be, rifle forgotten, lantern useless in the downpour, calling her name into the wind that swallowed it whole. He found her a quarter-mile out. Leg buckled beneath her in the mud, the half-healed wound torn open again from the strain of running, rain plastering her hair flat against a face that, for the first time since he'd met her, looked less like stone and more like a person who'd finally run out of places to be strong. Why, he said, kneeling, pulling her arm over his shoulders. Because staying feels like waiting to be caught. Nobody's catching you here. Everybody catches you somewhere. Eventually. He didn't have an answer for that. Not one he trusted himself to say without it sounding like a promise he couldn't guarantee. So instead he got her up, got her moving, half carried her back through mud that fought him every step, and said the only true thing he had. You can hate me all you want, he told her, rain running down both their faces, the cabin lantern glowing faint through the storm ahead. But you stay until that leg heals. After that, you're free. My word on it. She didn't answer. Didn't need to. She let him carry the weight the rest of the way, and something about that not agreement exactly. Just permission settled between them, like the first stone laid back onto that wall. She slept hard and long the next morning, exhausted past the point of watchfulness, for the first time since he found her, and Holt sat up with the fire built high, tending her reopened wound every hour or so, the way he'd have tended a wound on any creature too stubborn for its own good, which was, he was coming to understand, most of the creatures worth knowing. She woke past noon, disoriented, reaching for the knife under her pillow before her eyes had even finished focusing. Still here, he said, quiet, from across the room. Nobody came. She let her hand fall still, looked at him a long moment, something loosening behind her eyes that hadn't loosened before. You could have let me go last night, she said. Would have been easier. For both of us. Wasn't looking for easier. What were you looking for? He thought about that longer than the question probably deserved. Don't rightly know yet. Guess I'll tell you when I find it. She almost smiled at that, small and tired, and didn't push further. Some answers he was learning meant more left unfinished than forced whole before their time. Word reached Ashford Hollow fast, the way word always does in a town too small to keep its own secrets. 3 days after the storm, 2 riders came through at midday, slow, deliberate, close enough to the cabin that Holt met them at the fence line with his rifle unslung, but not raised. He recognized one of them from the crowd outside the sheriff's office. The other he didn't know at all. Just passing through, the stranger said. Smiled like it cost him nothing. Funny place to pass through. Nothing out this way but my fence. Mr. Voss thought you might have reconsidered your position by now, Calder. Man extends an offer of forgetting the whole business. You send her back to town quiet. Nobody's the wiser. Tell Voss I already gave my answer. He figured you might say that. The man's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went colder. Just so you know, we asked polite first. They turned their horses and rode off unhurried, and Holt stood at that fence line a long while after they'd gone, understanding exactly what kind of clock had just started running. That evening, Sula found him, still turning it over, sitting on the porch step with the rifle across his knees, not cleaning it, just holding it the way a man holds something he's not sure he trusts himself with yet. You're thinking too loud, she said, settling down beside him. I can hear it from the well. Just working out how many ways this goes wrong before it goes right. That's a scout's question, not a rancher's. Guess I'm both these days. He set the rifle aside finally, leaning it against the rail. Used to be good at reading what was coming before it arrived. Lately, I can't tell if that's a gift or just a habit that won't quit. She was quiet a moment, studying the darkening yard. Show me what you'd read here. Right now. What does a scout see that I don't? He almost waved it off. Then didn't, because something in the asking felt less like a test and more like an offer. The same kind of offer he'd been trying. Clumsy, to make her all weak without quite finding the words for it. Ground soft past the corral, he said, pointing. Rain 3 days back. Anybody crosses there tonight, they'll leave a print deep enough to read by moonlight, which means anybody smart circles wide through the rock instead. That's where I'd watch, if I were watching for trouble. Good. She nodded, something like approval in it. Now let me show you something. She led him out past the corral herself, crouching at the edge of the soft ground he'd just pointed to, and traced a shape in the dirt with one finger. Quick, economical. This, she said, is what a rabbit's track looks like when it's running from a hawk. Close together, dragging slightly, because it's not thinking about where its feet land anymore, only about getting away. She traced another shape beside it. This is what it looks like running from a coyote instead. Longer stride, more control, because a rabbit that's outrunning a coyote still believes it might win. A rabbit running from a hawk already knows it might not, and you can tell the difference just from that. My mother taught me before I could walk steady on my own, said the land is always telling you the truth about what's happened on it, if you're patient enough to ask it the right questions. She looked up at him. In the fading light, her eyes had gone soft in a way he hadn't seen from her before. You already know this. Different words. Same knowing. Different words. Same knowing, he repeated, testing the shape of it. Suppose that's most of what's between us so far. She didn't answer that directly, but she didn't move away either, and the two of them stayed crouched there a while longer in the near dark, past the point where there was enough light left to read anything at all, just because neither one particularly wanted to be the first to stand up and end it. 2 mornings later, the fence on the east ridge burned. Not the whole line, just enough. A message, not a disaster. The kind of damage that costs a man time and money without costing him his whole operation, which meant somebody wanted him worried, not ruined, yet. 2 mornings after that, Holt found a heifer dead in the north pasture, shot clean through, left where it fell like a signature nobody bothered to hide. He didn't tell Sula right away. She found out anyway, walking the fence line with him at dawn, standing over the dead animal with an expression that wasn't surprise. She crouched beside the carcass a long moment before either of them spoke, studying the ground around it the same patient way she'd studied everything else since she'd arrived. And when she finally straightened, she'd read more off that dirt than Holt had managed in his own first pass. 2 riders, she said. One held back near the tree line, kept watch. The other came in close for the shot, then circled wide before riding off, careful not to cross his own tracks twice. She pointed toward a faint scuff further out. They waited most of the night before taking it. Wanted you asleep when it happened. Didn't want a confrontation. Just a message left where you'd find it fresh come morning. You read that as clean as I would have 7 years back. Different teacher. Same lesson, I expect. She glanced at him, something almost approving in it, despite the grim circumstance. Your instincts aren't wrong, Calder. You just second-guess them more than you need to. Old habit. Worth breaking most days. Voss, she said. Not a question. Man doesn't sign his work. Doesn't need to. He'll keep going. I know, until you give me back. Holt looked at her then. Really looked. The way he hadn't quite let himself since the town square, and found something in her face he recognized because he'd worn it himself, years back, in places he didn't talk about. The particular exhaustion of a person who has spent their whole life being the reason other people get to feel afraid of something. Not going to happen, he said. You don't know what you're protecting yet. Don't need to know the whole of it to know it's worth protecting. She almost said something else. He watched her decide not to, watched the words gather behind her eyes, and then get swallowed back down, filed away for later, and he let her have that. Some things take their own time getting said. That same week, needing rope and nails he couldn't put off buying much longer, Holt rode out to Ezra Whitlock's spread, a half-day west, the nearest neighbor who wasn't tangled up in Ashford Hollow's business one way or another. Ezra was an old man now, ran fewer head than Holt did, but he'd known this territory longer than most men still breathing in it, and he'd never once asked Holt a question he didn't already half know the answer to. Heard what you did, Ezra said, handing over the rope without being asked twice for it. Whole territory's heard by now, I expect. Didn't do it for the audience, didn't figure you did. Ezra spat, considering. You understand Voss ain't just some fool with a grudge, Calder. Man's got his hand in half the deals from here to Prescott. Grazing leases, water rights. Word is he's been sniffing around 3 other valleys, same as this one, trying to clear title quiet before folks like that judge ever think to ask why. 3 other valleys. That I know of. Could be more. Man's patient when patience serves him, and mean as a rattler when it don't. Ezra studied Holt a long moment. You picked a fight with more than one land baron, son. You picked a fight with a whole way of doing business out here. That's a bigger thing to stand against than most folks manage in a lifetime. Didn't pick it. Just didn't walk away from it once it landed in front of me. Same thing, most days. Ezra almost smiled. You need anything else, you know where I am. Man's got to have somebody in his corner who ain't got a stake in the outcome. He paused before Holt could turn to go, something more thoughtful crossing his weathered face. My Rosalie used to say the measure of a man ain't what he does when everybody's watching. It's what he does when he could get away with doing nothing instead, and nobody would ever know the difference. He looked out over his own modest spread, quiet a moment. She's been gone 6 years now. Still find myself checking whether I'm living up to that measure most days. Figured you might understand that particular habit better than most folks I know. Understand it plenty, Holt said, something in Ezra's words landing closer to home than the old man likely realized. Figured you might. Ezra nodded once satisfied and turned back toward his own work. Go on then. Don't let an old man keep you from whatever's waiting back at that ranch of yours. Holt thanked him, rode home heavier than he'd ridden out, turning Ezra's words over the whole way back. 3 other valleys. Which meant this fight, however it ended, was never going to stay small enough to matter to just one ranch, one town, one woman kneeling in one dusty street. It was already bigger than that. He was only now catching up to exactly how much bigger. Sheriff Dunmore rode out 4 days after that. Alone, which Holt noted, because a man delivering a friendly warning usually brings company, and a man delivering something else entirely sometimes prefers no witnesses. Calder. Dunmore didn't get down from his horse. Bad sign, that. Man who doesn't dismount is a man who wants to leave quick if the conversation goes wrong. Sheriff, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Funny. Feels pretty simple from where I'm standing. Voss has got the territorial judge's ear. Got half the town's ear too, way things are going. You keep sheltering her, you're going to lose this ranch, maybe more than the ranch. Holt crossed his arms. That a warning or a threat, Sheriff? Dunmore's jaw worked for a second before he answered. Does it matter which? Matters to me. A long pause. Dunmore's horse shifted, restless, and for a moment the sheriff looked like a man, carrying something heavier than the badge on his chest, something Holt couldn't quite name yet, but would recognize soon enough for exactly what it was. I used to think this job was mostly about keeping the peace, Dunmore said, quieter now, almost to himself. Turns out it's mostly about deciding whose peace you're keeping. And whose have you been keeping, Sheriff? Dunmore didn't answer that one, just looked at Holt a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his tired eyes, and for half a second Holt thought the man might say something real, might finally let some of whatever he was carrying show. The moment passed. Just get rid of her, Calder, Dunmore said finally. Queed her now. Almost pleading, if a man like Dunmore ever let himself plead. Before this gets bigger than either one of us can walk back from. Then he turned his horse and rode off without waiting for an answer, and Holt stood there a long moment in the settling dust, turning the sheriff's words over and over, snagging on the wrongness of them without being able to say exactly why yet. Get rid of her. Not turn her in. Not hand her over to Voss. Get rid of her. Like Dunmore already knew what would happen to her either way, and just didn't want to be standing close enough to watch it happen. That night, sitting across the fire from her, the questions Holt had been swallowing for a week finally came up whether he wanted them to or not. You said something. Back in the square. Before they had you kneeling. Sula didn't look up from the fire. Said a lot of things. You looked at me different than you looked at anybody else in that crowd. Now she looked up, studied him the way she'd studied him that first day in the wash, weighing something, deciding. Because I've seen your face before, she said. A long time before Ashford Hollow. Holt went still. Something cold moved through his chest, slow, working its way down from his throat to his stomach, because some part of him had already half known this was coming, had known it since the moment their eyes met in that dirt street, and something in her expression had been recognition dressed up as defiance. Where, he said. Careful. Like the word itself might break something if he said it wrong. 7 years ago. A canyon 2 days north of here, soldiers came at dawn. My people were camped along the wash, thinking we were far enough from the fighting to be safe. Holt's hands had gone cold around the coffee cup he was holding. He set it down before he dropped it. I was 21, she said, old enough to understand exactly what was happening. Young enough that I still remember every single thing about that morning like it was carved into me instead of just remembered.
Sula, you were a scout. Flat.
Not accusing, exactly. Worse than accusing. Simply stating a fact she'd carried a long time and finally set down where he could see it. You rode ahead of the soldiers. Found our camp before they did. The fire popped between them. Neither one flinched. And you saw me, she said, half hidden in the brush at the edge of camp. You looked right at me. Holt's throat had closed around whatever he might have said, because he remembered now. Remembered it whole and sudden and complete the way a bad memory returns when its time finally comes. A young woman's face in the brush, terrified, and his own hand raising not toward her but away. A signal, a choice, the report he gave back to the column that sent them 2 miles wrong before they finally found the camp. 2 miles that gave half the people in it time to run. 2 miles that weren't enough for everyone. I let you go, he said. Quiet. Barely above the crackle of the fire. I sent the column the wrong way. On purpose. I know. You knew that? This whole time? I've known your face for 7 years, Calder. I just never expected to see it holding a rifle over my head again. The silence that followed had a different weight than any silence they'd shared before. Not hostile. Not quite forgiving either. Something in between, complicated. The kind of quiet that comes when two people finally set the same old wound down on the same table, and neither one knows yet whether it's about to heal or start bleeding fresh. Why didn't you something, Holt asked, back in town, when it mattered most? Because I wasn't sure yet if the man who saved one girl in a canyon was the same man standing in front of me. Wasn't sure if you even remembered. I remembered everything. I know that now too. He wanted to ask her the rest of it. Wanted to know who else had been in that camp, who hadn't made it those 2 miles, whether the choice he'd made that morning had cost as much as he'd spent 7 years afraid it had. But her face had closed again, just slightly, the door not shut but no longer standing wide open either, and he understood this wasn't a story that finished itself in one night by a fire. Some debts take longer than that to pay down. He was starting to understand this one might take the rest of his life. Voss didn't wait long to escalate. 6 days after the fire, riders came through in the night, 3 of them, and left behind 2 more dead cattle and a message scratched into the barn door with a knife, last warning. Holt found it at dawn, Sula already beside him. By the time he'd read it twice. He's done waiting, she said. Seems that way. You should let me go, Calder, before it costs you everything. Already told you. Not going to happen. You don't owe me anything anymore. You told me the truth, I heard it. That canyon that settled between us. This isn't about the canyon. Then what is it about? Holt looked at the barn door, at the knife mark still fresh in the wood, deep enough to have taken real anger to carve. Then back at her. It's about what happens if I let a man like Voss decide who gets to live in this territory, and who doesn't, he said, canyon or no canyon. I'm done standing off to the side while that happens. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice had shifted, something new in it, cautious, like she was testing weight on ice she still wasn't sure would hold. There's more to why he wants me than you think, she said. Holt turned fully toward her now. Go on, it's not about the cattle. Not really about me either. Not entirely. There's a document. Hidden. Something Voss wants gone before the territorial judge ever gets a look at it. What kind of document? She hesitated. Not from mistrust, he realized. From the sheer weight of finally saying it out loud after guarding it for so long. A treaty, she said. Federal. 7 years old, signed and then hidden the same season, before it ever had a chance to become inconvenient to somebody. It says the whole valley Voss is trying to sell to the railroad company was never his to sell in the first place. Holt felt something shift into place, slow and heavy, the way pieces do right before a picture finally makes sense. That's what this whole thing has been about, he said. From the start. From the start. And you know where it's hidden. She met his eyes, and for the first time since the wash, since the town square, since the fire in the canyon, and everything laid bare between them, there was something almost like trust sitting there. Fragile. New but real. I do, she said. But if I show you, Calder, there's no walking back from it. Not for you. Not for this ranch. Not for either one of us. Holt looked past her, Out toward the ridge where the fence still bore the black scorch marks from the first fire. Out toward the barn door, carved with a warning he had no intention of heeding. "Good," he said, "because I stopped walking back the second I lowered that rifle in the town square. Might as well keep going forward." She almost smiled at that. The first real one he'd seen from her. It didn't last long, because that same afternoon, riding into town for supplies he could no longer avoid needing, Holt found out exactly how far the ground beneath him had already shifted without his knowing it. He felt it before he even reached the sheriff's office. Two of Voss's men were posted outside the mercantile, not doing anything, just standing, watching the street, with the particular idleness of men who'd been told to be seen more than to be useful. One of them nodded at Holt as he passed, slow, deliberate, the kind of nod that wasn't a greeting so much as a note being taken. Holt kept his pace even, didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Inside the mercantile, the clerk behind the counter, a younger man Holt only half knew, hired on sometime in the last year to help run what was, in practice if not in name, one more piece of Voss's growing reach through this territory, took his time filling the order, slower than the empty store had any reason to require. "Heard you've got company out at your place," the clerk said, not looking up from the scale. "Unusual company. Heard wrong if you heard anything worth repeating." "Just making conversation," Calder. The man finally met his eyes, something careful and unfriendly behind the politeness. "Mr. Voss says folks ought to know their neighbor's business times like these. Safety of the town and all. Mr. Voss says a lot of things." Holt set his coin on the counter exact. "No more in the transaction required. Doesn't make them true." The clerk didn't answer that, just finished wrapping the order in paper, and Holt left without another word, aware the whole exchange would find its way back to Voss inside the hour, aware that was probably the entire point of it. A message delivered without needing to be shouted across a street this time. Just a clerk, a scale. A few careful words dropped like stones into still water to see how far the ripples traveled. He went to see Dunmore first. Told himself it was about the dead cattle, the burned fence, filing a complaint like a man who still believed in the shape of the law out here. Some old habit, maybe, some leftover faith he wasn't ready to admit he still carried. The sheriff's office was empty when he walked in. Should have turned around right then. Instead he waited, and that waiting was how he ended up seeing the ledger open on Dunmore's desk, half hidden under a stack of wanted notices, columns of numbers that made no sense for a sheriff's salary in a town this size. Every entry marked with the same small symbol at the margin instead of a name, a shorthand a careful man might use if he wanted a record without wanting it readable to anyone who didn't already know what the mark stood for. Holt had seen that same mark once before, burned into a shipping crate outside Voss's warehouse, stamped on a grazing lease Voss had pushed through the county 2 winters back, a private cipher, a rich man's habit of leaving his signature everywhere and nowhere at once. Holt was still standing over that ledger, cold moving through him, slow and certain when the door opened behind him and Dunmore walked in and saw exactly what Holt was looking at. Neither man said anything for a long moment. "Wasn't supposed to see that," Dunmore said finally. Quiet, almost relieved, in a strange way, like a weight easing off him even as his face went pale. "How long?" Holt said. "Does it matter?" "How long, Dunmore?" The sheriff sat down slow, like his legs had stopped being entirely reliable. 2 years, started small, a favor here, a blind eye there. By the time I understood what I'd actually signed up for, I was already too deep in to climb back out clean. You knew what he wanted her for. The whole time. I knew he wanted that treaty gone. Didn't know how far he'd go to make it happen. Didn't want to know, if I'm honest with you." Holt's hands had curled into fists without his noticing. "You told me to get rid of her, knowing what waited for it the second I did. I told you because it was the only way I could see to keep you out of this, Calder. I never wanted—" Dunmore stopped himself, swallowed, started again. "Smaller. It doesn't matter what I wanted. Doesn't change what I did." "No," Holt said. "It doesn't." He walked out without another word, because there wasn't one worth saying yet, not until he understood the whole shape of what he was standing inside of. But riding back toward the ranch, sun dropping low and gold across land that had suddenly become a great deal more dangerous than it looked, Holt understood one thing with total clarity. The law in Ashford Hollow wasn't neutral, hadn't been for 2 years, which meant whatever came next, whatever Voss had planned for that hidden treaty, And the woman who knew where to find it, there'd be no badge standing between them and the worst of it. There'd only be Holt, and whatever he was willing to become to keep his word. He found Sula waiting on the porch when he rode in, already reading something in his face before he'd said a single word. "It's worse than the cattle," she said. "Not a question. Dunmore's been taking Voss's money. 2 years." She absorbed that in silence, the last flicker of anything resembling safety draining slowly out of her expression. "Then there's nobody left to stop him," she said. Holt swung down off the horse, stood in front of her, in the fading light, the ranch quiet around them, the mountains going purple at the edges the way they did every evening at the exact hour she used to stand at the tree line, keeping her silent appointment with something he still didn't fully understand. "There's still us," he said. She looked at him a long moment, weighing it. Weighing him maybe one more time, the way she'd been doing since the wash, since the town square, since the fire beside which he'd told her the truth about a canyon 7 years gone. "You understand what tomorrow could cost you," she said. "Truly cost you. Not just the ranch. Voss doesn't lose gracefully," Calder. "Men like him never do. Understood it the moment I lowered that rifle. Been walking toward this particular tomorrow ever since, whether I called it by name or not. And you're not afraid." "Course I'm afraid. Man who says otherwise is either lying or hasn't thought it through proper." He met her eyes steady in the fading light. "Just decided a while back that being afraid and doing the right thing anyway aren't opposites. They're just two things that happen to live in the same chest most days." Something in her expression softened at that, fuller than anything she'd let him see before, and for a moment neither of them needed to say anything else at all. "All right, Calder," she said finally. "Then we do this together. Starting tomorrow. I'll show you where it's hidden." Behind them, the sun finished going down over a ranch that no longer felt anything like safe. Somewhere out past the ridge, past the burned fence and the carved warning on the barn door, Garrett Voss was already making his next move, certain the woman and the treaty, and the stubborn rancher who'd started all this trouble would be handled soon enough. He had no idea yet how wrong he was about to be. They left before the sun cleared the ridge, because dawn was the only hour that still belonged to them, the only stretch of the day Voss's men hadn't yet learned to watch. Sula rode ahead this time. No rope. No hesitation. She knew this country the way Holt knew the shape of his own fence line. Every wash and boulder filed away somewhere behind her eyes, and he found himself trusting her lead without once questioning it. They didn't talk much on the ride. Some silences fill a space. This one carried weight instead, dense with everything unsaid since the fire, since the canyon confession, since the ledger on Dunmore's desk that had cracked something open in Holt he wasn't sure how to close back up. An hour in, she finally spoke. "My father used to say a hidden thing stays hidden only as long as the person who buried it stays alive to remember where. That's supposed to comfort me? Supposed to warn you. Fair enough." He let it sit. They rode another stretch in silence, climbing now, the flat range giving way to broken country, rock outcrops standing up out of the scrub like the bones of something enormous that had lain down here and never quite finished decaying. The trail narrowed at a creek crossing swollen from the storm days back, water moving faster and higher than it had any business moving through country this dry, and Sula reined up short at the bank, studying it a long moment before choosing a line across. "Give your horse his head here," she said. "Don't fight him for footing, he can feel better than you can." Holt did as told, and the crossing went easier for the trusting, water-climbing cold to his stirrups, but never past them. Both horses picking their way over unseen stone with a sureness Holt wouldn't have managed alone. On the far bank, wringing water from the hem of her sleeve, Sula glanced back at him with something almost like approval. "You listen better than most men I've ridden with," she said. "Learned young that not listening gets a scout killed quicker than most things do." "Good. Keep listening, then. Country gets less forgiving from here." They rode a while longer before she spoke again, unprompted this time, her voice carrying a different weight than her usual measured calm. "I haven't been back this way since that morning," she admitted. 7 years, and I've circled this whole stretch of country a dozen times over, always finding some reason to go around instead of through. Didn't have to come today either. Could have told me where to look and stayed behind. Could have. Didn't want to." She was quiet a moment, working through something. "There's a difference between avoiding a place because it still owns you, and choosing not to go there because you've simply got no need to." I stopped being sure. Somewhere these Past 7 years, which one of those was actually true for me. Figured it was past time I found out. And now? Which is it? She considered the question with the same careful patience she gave most things, and when she finally answered, something in her voice had settled, steadier than before. Ask me again once we've reached it, she said. I'll know the answer by then, one way or the other. Holt found his mind drifting the way it always did on long rides. Backward, to a column of dust 7 years gone, to a report he'd given, in a voice that hadn't shaken, even though every other part of him had. You're thinking about it again, Sula said without turning. How do you know that? Because you go quiet a particular way, different from your regular quiet. He didn't ask how she'd already learned to tell the difference. Some things a person just knows about another person, given enough hard days spent close together, and questioning the knowing only ever made it feel less true. The canyon she led him to wasn't much to look at from the trail, just another split in the rock, one of 100 scattered through this stretch of territory, easy to ride past without a second glance unless you already knew what you were looking for. She dismounted at the mouth of it, stood a moment. Still, this is where you were, Holt said, quiet, understanding arriving slow. Seven years ago, this is the canyon. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had gone somewhere else, somewhere younger. My people camped here for 3 generations before that morning, after nobody wanted to come back, except somebody had to, because the treaty was buried here before the soldiers ever came, hidden long before anybody knew it would need hiding from you too. Holt followed her in silence through the narrowing walls, rock rising on either side until the sky above them thinned to a ribbon, and something in his chest tightened with every step deeper, because he remembered this place. Not clearly, not in pictures, in sensation. Dust and smoke and a young woman's face in the brush. 7 years buried and rising back up now with every boot print he laid down beside hers. Here, she said finally. A crevice in the rock face, waist height, easy to miss unless a hand already knew the exact angle to reach in. She knelt, reached, went still. Sula. She didn't answer. Her hand was still in the crevice, searching, fingers moving faster now, frantic, in a way Holt hadn't seen from her since the wash 9 days back. It's not here, she said. Check again. Might have shipped. I know this hiding place better than I know my own hands, Calder. It is not here. She pulled her arm back. Empty. Turned to him with an expression he'd never seen on her before. Not fear exactly, something colder. The particular blankness of a person doing frantic math behind a still face. Somebody knew, she said. Maybe. Or maybe somebody just got lucky. Holt crouched at the mouth of the crevice, studying the ground in front of it instead of the empty space inside it. Old habit. A scout doesn't read the hole, he reads what's around it. The dirt told its own story once he slowed down enough to look. A boot print, half a size bigger than his own, pressed into softer ground near the base of the rock. A second one beside it, and a third further back. All 3 pointed the same careless direction, the kind of tracks left by men who didn't much care whether anybody noticed them. And near the boulder, half buried, the stub end of a hand-rolled cigarette, tobacco he recognized from the same brand sold at the mercantile Voss half-owned. They were here, Holt said. Not long ago either. Sula knelt beside him, studying the same ground, and for a moment her composure slipped entirely, something raw and furious crossing her face before she caught it and pushed it back down. 7 years, she said quiet, more to herself than to him. 7 years I trusted this hiding place with everything that mattered, and some careless man, with a shovel and no idea what he was looking at, just walked in and took it in an afternoon. That's not on you. In an afternoon. Feels like it is. Man burns down a house. That's not on the house for standing where it could be found. Holt held her gaze steady. This is on Voss. All of it. Don't let him hand you a piece of blame that was never yours to carry. She held his eyes a long moment, something in her shoulders easing just slightly, the fury settling into something steadier, more useful. How did they find this exact spot, she asked again. Calmer now, maybe they didn't, not exactly. Holt stood, looking up and down the length of the narrow canyon, at 3, 4, 5 other shallow crevices scattered along the same rock face, each one just as easy to miss as the one she'd used. He walked the length of it, slow, and found what he was looking for soon enough, the same careless boot prints clustered at 2 more of the crevices further along, dirt turned over fresh, at each one. One abandoned half dug when whoever had been digging must have finally struck the right hollow. Look around you. This whole wall's full of hiding places. I'd wager Voss's men have been digging through every old campsite in this territory for months, turning over every crevice and cache they could find, betting sooner or later they'd get lucky on the one that mattered. That's a great deal of digging for a guess. Man's trying to clear title on a whole valley before a federal judge gets a good look at it. That's worth a great deal of digging. Ezra Whitlock told me last week Voss has got the same kind of trouble brewing in 3 other valleys besides this one. This isn't the only hole his men have been turning over. She was quiet a moment, turning that over, and something in her shoulders eased just slightly. The particular relief of learning a wound wasn't quite as personal as it had first felt. Not a betrayal from someone close, just the grinding, patient cruelty of money, with enough time on its hands to search every hole in a hillside until it found the right one. Then he has it, she said. The real one. Looks that way. Which means we've got nothing. Holt looked at her a long moment. Something in him, some old scouting instinct that refused to let a trail go cold just because the obvious path was already turning the problem over from a different angle. Not nothing, he said. Your father knew this hiding place, which means he knew the treaty's contents too, word for word probably. Same as you seem to. My father is dead, Calder. You told me his body was never found. She went very still. They sat with that a long while, the canyon walls holding the silence close around them, neither one willing to be the one who said the next thing out loud first. Even if he's alive, Sula said finally, careful, like she was handling something that might shatter if gripped too tight. 7 years is a long time for a person to stay hidden. If he wanted to be found, Calder, he would have come looking for me by now, for any of us. Unless finding you meant putting you in danger. Unless staying hidden was the only way he knew to keep whoever else survived that morning safe too. She considered that, and Holt watched the hope she'd been guarding so carefully start to war openly, now with 7 years of practiced grief. Neither one willing to fully surrender the ground to the other. Even if you're right, she said, we don't know where to look. The mountains north of here run for 200 miles in every direction that matters. Then, we start with what we do know. Somebody's been asking after an old Apache man living rough in the high country. Dunmore was asking 2 weeks before he died, which means Dunmore had a lead worth following, and dead men don't usually chase leads that go nowhere. You want to pick up where a corrupt sheriff left off. I want to pick up where a man who was trying, too late, to do one decent thing left off. Different thing entirely. Holt met her eyes steady. Your choice, Sula. I'm not going to push you toward a hope you're not ready to hold. But I'm not going to talk you out of it either if it's a hope you want to chase. She was quiet a long moment, the canyon wind moving soft through the narrow rock above them, and when she finally spoke, her voice had steadied into something that sounded less like fear now and more like resolve. We chase it, she said carefully, but we chase it. They rode back to the ranch first, had to, because riding blind into the mountains after a 7-year-old ghost wasn't a plan. It was a wish, and Holt had learned the hard way during his scouting years that wishes get people killed faster than bullets do. What they found waiting at the ranch changed the shape of everything. Doc Sutter's wagon was pulled up outside the cabin, which made no sense because nobody had sent for the doctor, and Holt's stomach dropped a foot before he'd even swung down off his horse. Calder. Sutter met them at the porch steps, hat in hand, face doing that particular grim work of a man who spent his whole career learning how to deliver bad news without flinching and still hasn't gotten used to it. What happened? Sheriff Dunmore. Sutter's voice caught, just slight him this morning. Down by the creek behind his office. They're calling it an accident. Horse, spooked, hit his head on the rocks. They're calling it that. I'm telling you what I found, Calder. Not what I believe. Which meant Sutter believed something else entirely, and was too careful a man to say it plain in the open air. Holt felt the ground shift under him again, same as it had in Dunmore's office 3 days back, staring at that ledger. Because a man doesn't confess to 2 years of taking dirty money and then conveniently fall off a horse 4 days later. That was a message, the same kind Voss had already carved into a barn door once before. There's something else, Sutter said. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small folded paper, worn soft at the creases like it had been handled and rehandled by anxious fingers. He came to me 2 nights back. Asked me to hold this. Said if anything happened to him, I was to get it to you and nobody else. Holt took it, unfolded slow. A hand-copied page. Rough, hurried, but unmistakable the same language. The same federal seal sketched crudely in the corner that Sula had described from the original treaty. Dunmore had made a copy. At some point before Voss's men ever got to the real one, the sheriff had gone into that canyon himself, or sent somebody, and taken down every word of it by hand. Because he knew, Holt realized, he knew Voss would come for the original eventually. And some buried piece of the man's conscience, the same piece that had told Holt to get rid of her, please, before this gets bigger than either one of us can walk back, from that same piece had made him hedge against his own corruption. Just in case. There's a note folded inside, Sutter said quietly. He wrote it out loud to me before he sealed it, made sure I understood every word right, like he wanted a witness besides just paper. Holt unfolded the second sheet. Calder, if you're reading this, I didn't make it back to tell you myself, which means I ran out of time to fix what I helped break. I copied this the week after you brought her in, before I knew for certain which side I still had it in me to stand on. Voss doesn't know I have it. Wanted to hand it over clean, to the judge, to somebody who'd use it right, and I kept telling myself there was time. There wasn't. Do what I couldn't. D. Holt read it twice. Then a third time, slower, like the words might rearrange themselves into something less final if he looked hard enough. Sula had gone very still beside him, reading over his shoulder, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of its usual steadiness left in it. He tried to fix it. Too late for himself. Not too late for what matters. Voss killed him for this. Voss killed him because this proves everything Voss has spent months trying to bury. Holt folded the paper carefully, tucked it inside his own coat, close to his chest, the same coat he'd once wrapped around Sula's shoulders in front of half the town. Which means we're not just chasing a stolen treaty anymore. We've got a copy. And now Voss knows somebody out there does too, even if he doesn't know it's us yet. For how long? Not long. Man like that doesn't leave loose threads hanging once he's already killed to cut one. Sutter, still standing there hat in hand, cleared his wet throat. There's one more thing, Calder. Before he died, Dunmore asked around some, quiet, about survivors from an old raid up north. Kept asking if anybody'd heard rumors of an old Apache man living rough in the high country, alone or with a small band, going back years. Said he was trying to find somebody who could speak to the original treaty's boundaries firsthand. Somebody who'd actually seen the land divided the old way. Sula's breath caught audibly. Did he find anybody? She asked. Barely a whisper now. Didn't say. Only that he'd started looking 2 weeks back and seemed to think he was getting close. 2 weeks, which meant Dunmore had been chasing the same ghost. Holt and Sula had only just started chasing themselves, the sheriff, working some fractured redemption in secret, even while still taking Voss's money with the other hand, a man split clean down the middle and trying too late to end up on the right side of the split. He'd run out of time. They couldn't afford to. In town that same afternoon, before word of Dunmore's death had even finished traveling from house to house, folks were already choosing which version of the story to believe. Ferris was behind the counter at the feed store when 2 of his regular customers came in arguing about it, low but not low enough, and he found himself listening more than working. Horse spooked him is all, one of the men said, hauling a sack of grain onto his shoulder. Man rode that same trail 100 times. Bad luck, nothing more. Bad luck don't usually leave a man's boots on the wrong feet when they find him, the other said. My cousin helped carry him in. Said the whole scene looked wrong. Just nobody wants to say wrong out loud with Voss's men standing on every corner. Ferris kept his eyes on the register, saying nothing, but the words lodged in him anyway, the way words do when a man's already halfway to believing something he doesn't want to. He'd seen the crowd outside his own shop 9 days back, seen Calder lower that rifle when every voice in the street had wanted him to raise it instead. He hadn't known what to make of it then. He was starting to understand now that a man who wouldn't kill on command probably wasn't the sort of man who'd lie about what he found either. Nobody said Voss's name out loud in the open street, not yet. But the shape of the doubt was already moving through Ashford Hollow the way smoke moves through a house before anybody smells the fire. That night at the saloon, the doubt finally found enough voices willing to carry it out loud. Ferris was there, nursing a beer he wasn't much interested in drinking, and the Kessler boy's father besides, and a handful of others who'd stood in that crowd 9 days back, wanting a hanging and left instead with more questions than they knew what to do with. I'm not saying Voss did it, one man argued low. Careful even here. I'm saying it's mighty convenient timing, is all. Sheriff finds religion about crooked dealings. Sheriff turns up dead 4 days later. You say that like it's the first convenient thing that's ever happened around Garrett Voss, Ferris said, surprising himself with how steady his own voice came out. Man's had convenient things happening in his favor for 2 years running. Grazing leases nobody else could get approved. Water rights that somehow always fell his direction. I never asked why too hard, on account of I like keeping my store open. And now? Ferris turned his beer glass a slow half circle on the bar, thinking. Now I keep picturing Calder kneeling in that street, cutting a rope instead of pulling a trigger everybody in this room expected him to pull. Man doesn't do that for nothing. Doesn't risk everything he's got over a woman he only met that same morning, unless he's already seen something the rest of us haven't caught up to yet. Nobody had a ready answer for that. The conversation didn't resolve itself that night, not fully, but something had shifted in the room regardless, the same way something had shifted in the street 9 days back. A town's certainty, cracking open one uncomfortable question at a time. We go north, Holt said, back at the ranch, the sun already dropping low. Tonight, into the high country. On a rumor. On a rumor that got a man killed for chasing it, means somebody out there is worth killing to keep quiet. He looked at her steady. If there's a chance it's who you think it might be, don't, she said again. Softer this time. Not a warning anymore. Something closer to fear of hoping too hard. I'm not promising you anything, Sula. I'm saying we ride till we know for certain, one way or the other. You've spent 7 years not knowing. I don't figure one more night of riding is going to make that any harder to bear than it already is. She held his eyes a long moment, then nodded once, and went to saddle a fresh horse before either one of them could talk themselves out of the ride. The high country north of Silver Bend climbed fast and rough, switchbacks cut into rock that hadn't been meant for horses, only for feet and patience and the kind of knowledge passed down instead of mapped. Sula led. Holt followed. Neither one spoke much, because the climb took what breath they had, and because some silences are better used for listening than talking. Somewhere past midnight, they stopped to rest the horses at a shallow overhang. Stars thick overhead in a way they never quite managed to be from the ranch. The whole sky crowded and close and strange. Sula sat with her knees drawn up, looking out at all that open dark. Can I ask you something? Holt said. You're going to whether I answer or not. Fair. He almost smiled. That night at the fire, you said you knew my face for 7 years. Never told anybody what I did. Not your father. Not your cousin. Nobody I told my father. She was quiet a moment. He asked me once, years after, whether I hated the scout who'd looked right at me and said nothing. I told him I didn't know yet. He said that was an honest enough answer for a wound that young. And now? She considered the question a long while before answering, turning it the way she'd turned that piece of sinew cord back at the cabin, patient, unhurried. Now I think hate is a simpler thing to carry than what I actually feel, she said. Simpler doesn't mean truer. Holt didn't have anything to say back to that. Just sat with it, the way he was learning to sit with most things she told him, letting it settle instead of rushing to answer. After a while, she leaned back against the rock, close enough that her shoulder found his without either of them quite deciding it should, and neither one moved away from it. Get some rest, she said finally. Morning's going to want all of us it can get. You first. I don't sleep well in open country. Never have. Then I'll watch. You rest. She studied him a moment in the starlight, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, and then, without another word, closed them, and let herself, for the first time since he'd known her, actually sleep with somebody else standing guard over the dark. He kept watch through the coldest hour of the night, and somewhere past 2, he caught the faint orange glimmer of a distant campfire far below on the flatland they'd left behind, too far off to be anything but a guess that settled uneasy in his gut all the same. Voss's men, maybe, still searching the lower canyons for whatever they hadn't yet found. Or nothing at all, just his own scout's instinct manufacturing danger out of empty dark the way it sometimes did, when a man had spent too many years trained to expect the worst. He didn't wake her over it. Whatever it was, it stayed far below them, and by the time the sky started graying toward dawn, the distant light had guttered out entirely, leaving nothing behind but the ordinary dark of a mountain morning not yet ready to become day. They found the smoke before they found the camp. A thin gray thread rising off a ridge 2 miles further in, the kind of fire built small and smart by somebody who'd learned the hard way what a big fire attracts. Could be anybody, Holt said low. Could be. Sula's hand had gone to the knife at her belt, without her seeming to notice she'd done it. Only one way to find that out. They left the horses tied a quarter-mile back and went the rest on foot, careful, quiet. The way Holt hadn't moved through country like this since his scouting years. Old muscle memory waking up in his legs and his breathing, and the flat, careful placement of every boot. The camp, when they finally reached it, wasn't much. A handful of brush shelters tucked into a fold of rock where the fierce smoke would scatter before it ever rose high enough to be seen from below. 6 people, maybe 7. Thin, careful, watchful, the particular wariness of folks who'd learned survival meant staying invisible. An old man sat closest to the fire, gray-haired, broad through the shoulders despite his age, a face carved deep with the kind of lines that come from carrying grief a very long time without ever once setting it down. He looked up as they approached, went very still. Sula stopped walking entirely. For a long moment, nobody said anything at all. Just the fire, crackling small and careful between them, and 2 people staring at each other across 7 years like the ground itself had opened up, and was deciding whether to let them fall through it or hold them steady. Sula, the old man said. Just her name, broken clean in half by the saying of it. She crossed the distance at a run. Holt stood back and let it happen without him. Let the reunion be theirs alone. The old man's arms coming up around her, like something rebuilding itself after 7 years of standing in ruins. Both of them saying words in a language Holt didn't understand and didn't need to, because grief and relief sound the same in every tongue there ever was. It was a long while before anybody spoke English again. The others in the camp watched from a careful distance at first, and Holt watched them back, taking in each face the way he'd once been trained to take in a whole landscape at a glance. A young man near his own age, missing 2 fingers on his left hand, kept himself positioned between Holt and the fire without ever making it look deliberate. His name, Holt would learn before the night was through, was Bosch, and he'd lost the fingers the same morning he'd lost his father, a detail he offered up plain and unadorned later that night, the way a person offers up an old fact that stopped being able to wound them fresh. An older woman named Itahai stirred something in a battered pot and never once looked up, though Holt had the distinct feeling she'd cataloged him fully within the first 10 seconds. A girl no older than 16, quick-eyed and quiet, sat closest to the old man. Her name was Lozan, same as a warrior her mother had told her stories about since before she could walk, and she was clearly the one who'd keep watch through the night once everyone else finally slept. Survival, Holt understood, looking at them, wasn't a single skill. It was a whole language these people had been forced to become fluent in. The same way Sula had, the same patient watching, the same economy of movement, nothing wasted, nothing given away for free. Later, once introductions had settled, and the fire had been fed fresh wood against the mountain cold, Bosch told a story to the younger ones gathered near him, low, rhythmic half-song, about a coyote who tried to outsmart the moon and lost everything but his cleverness for the trying. Lozan laughed at the parts she'd clearly heard 100 times before, and still found funny anyway, and even Itahai allowed herself something close to a smile over her cooking pot. Holt sat at the edge of it, not understanding half the words, understanding all of the feeling underneath them, and thought, not for the first time since meeting Sula, how much of what he'd once been taught to fear about. These people had never once resembled the actual people themselves. The old man's name, once Sula finally found the composure to make introductions, was one the small camp used with real reverence, Great Elk. The survivors called him, though he waved off the honor of it with a tired hand, like a title he'd stopped believing he deserved, somewhere along the last 7 years of hiding. You brought a white man, he said. Not unkind, just weighing it, the way everyone weighed Holt these days. He's the reason I'm alive to bring anybody, Sula said. There's more to tell you than we have hours for, but it starts with him. Great Elk studied Holt a long moment. Something in his gaze sharpened, focused, like he was trying to match a face against a memory buried 7 years deep. You were the scout, he said slowly. The one who rode ahead of the column. My daughter has already told you what that cost, I expect. She has. Some of it, then I will tell you the rest, since you've come all this way carrying it. Great Elk's eyes held Holt's, steady, grave. My wife did not make it those 2 miles. 3 of my brother's children did not make it. But 11 of us did, scout. 11 people who are alive today, scattered across this territory, because a column rode northeast instead of straight into a camp full of sleeping families. I have spent 7 years trying to decide whether to hate you or thank you. Have not fully decided yet. I understand if you never do. No. Great Elk shook his head slowly. I think today I finally have. Because a man who lies once out of fear to save his own conscience, that man does not ride 7 years later straight into a rifle standoff to protect the same woman a second time. That man walks away. You did not walk away. Something loosened in Holt's chest that had been wound tight for 7 years straight. Not forgiveness, exactly. Understanding, maybe a debt not erased, but finally, for the first time, weighed honestly on both sides of the scale. There's something else you should know, Great Elk said, and his voice shifted now, moving from the personal into something graver, something that made Sula go very still beside him. About why the column found us at all that morning. Somebody reported the camp, Holt said slowly. Old scouting instinct working the problem even now. Before I ever got there. Somebody did, a different scout. One who rode with your unit. I never learned his name. Only that 2 soldiers from your column were later punished for the delay you caused, sent to a harder posting, some said for the northeast lie. Great Elk's eyes held Holt's, steady, grave. Word came back to us years later, through traitors, that the 2 soldiers sent to that harder post did not survive it. A raid, further north, both killed within the year. Holt felt the floor of his own memory buckle, because he'd never known that. Never once, in 7 years of carrying the guilt of what the delay might have cost the camp, had he considered the cost might have landed the other direction, too. 2 of his own men, punished for his lie. Dead within a year because of a posting they'd been sent to on account of his choice. He'd spent 7 years grieving one side of a scale he hadn't even known had 2 sides. Their names were Corporal Whitfield and Private Reyes, Great Elk said quietly, and Holt's chest seized at hearing names he did remember. Faces he could still picture clear as yesterday, men he'd shared a fire with more nights than he could count. I only know this because a traitor who once served alongside them told it to me years later, over whiskey he didn't know I understood the meaning of. I didn't know, Holt said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. I swear to you, I never knew what happened to them after. I believe you didn't. Great Elk's voice gentled, just slightly, which is its own kind of mercy and its own kind of curse, Scout. You saved 11 lives that morning and never knew the 2 men punished for it paid with theirs. You have been carrying half a truth for 7 years. Perhaps it is time you carried the whole of it, instead. Holt sat with that a long moment. The fire crackled. Somewhere behind him he was aware of Sula watching him carefully, not with pity, something steadier than pity. Like she understood exactly what it cost a person to have an old wound reopened only to discover it was twice as deep as they'd believed. Doesn't change what I did, Holt said finally. Quiet. No, Great Elk agreed. It only changes what it cost. That is not nothing, Scout. A man who understands the true weight of a choice carries it different than a man who only guesses at it. Because that was the truth of it, wasn't it? Holt had spent 7 years imagining the cost of that morning in one direction only, the guilt of a woman he might not have saved, the families who hadn't made the 2 miles. He'd never once let himself imagine the cost running the other way too. 2 soldiers, men who'd trusted him, paying a price he'd never known to grieve. Guilt, it turned out, wasn't a straight line. It was a whole territory, and he'd only ever mapped half of it. They stayed at the camp through the night. Great Elk confirmed everything. Sula needed confirmed about the treaty's true boundaries, the old divisions, the federal promises made 7 years back and buried the moment they became inconvenient to somebody with railroad money in his eyes. There is a second copy, Great Elk said as the fire burned low, and both Holt and Sula went alert at once. Not paper. Kept by my people longer than any paper has ever lasted out here. Passed hand to hand. Memorized as much as written. In case paper ever failed us the way paper has a habit of failing people who trust it too much. Where? Holt asked. Great Elk smiled, small and tired. Where it has always been. In the words of everyone still alive who remembers them. He looked to Sula. You know the account as well as I do, daughter. You have known it since, before that morning, when your mother made you repeat the boundaries back to her every evening like a lullaby, so it would live in you, even if the paper did not survive. Sula's eyes had gone bright, glassy, and she nodded slow, something settling into her posture that Holt hadn't seen there before. Certainty, maybe. Purpose finally landing whole instead of scattered in pieces. I remember it, she said. All of it. Then Voss can burn every scrap of paper he ever finds, Great Elk said. He cannot burn what lives in a person's memory. Not unless he silences every last one of us who carries it. and there are more of us left than he knows. Bosch, who'd been listening quiet from the edge of the fire this whole time, spoke up then. He'll try anyway, he said, flexing the hand that had cost him 2 fingers 7 years back, like the memory of it still occasionally surprised him. Men like that always try. Then we make certain he fails, Great Elk said, as many times as he tries. Later, once the fire had burned to embers, and most of the camp had settled to sleep, Great Elk asked Sul to sit with him a while apart from the others, and though Holt couldn't follow the words that passed between them, he watched the shape of it, plainly enough a father, passing something to a daughter that had nothing to do with treaties or boundaries at all. At one point, Great Elk took a small carved stone from a pouch at his belt, worn smooth from years of handling, and pressed it into Sula's palm, closing her fingers over it with both his own hands, speaking low and steady the whole while. Sula's composure held until the very end of it, and then didn't, tears finally coming free in a way Holt understood. Watching from a respectful distance, she'd been holding back since the moment she first saw the old man's face across that fire. Later, once she'd rejoined him, Holt didn't ask what had passed between them. She told him anyway, unprompted, turning the small stone over in her fingers. "It belonged to my mother," she said. "He carried it all this time, hoping he'd live long enough to give it back to somebody who'd remember what it meant. What does it mean? That grief and hope can live in the same hand, if you're patient enough to hold both." She closed her fingers around it again. "Careful. He said I should give it to somebody someday, when I found a person worth trusting with that much of myself." She didn't say more than that. Didn't need to. Holt understood well enough what she wasn't quite ready to say out loud yet, and let the moment settle unspoken between them, the same patient way she'd taught him to let most things settle since the wash. Holt found himself sitting a little apart from the others, Sula settling down beside him without a word, the two of them looking out at the same dark ridge line Great Elk's people had been watching, hidden for 7 long years. "Thank you," she said quiet, after a while. "For what? For not making me ride up here alone with a rumor. For not letting me hope by myself if it turned out to be nothing. Wasn't going to let you carry that particular weight solo. Didn't seem right." She was quiet a moment, studying the dying fire. "You keep saying things like that. Like it cost you nothing. Cost me plenty. Just decided a while back some costs are worth paying." She looked at him then, something soft moving behind her eyes that hadn't been there in the wash, in the town square, in any of the careful days since. "I'm glad it was you who found me in that brush, Calder. Out of every rider Voss could have sent after me, every stranger who could have come across me first." "So am I," he said, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in longer than he could remember. They rode back down out of the high country at first light, the copy from Dunmore folded safe against Holt's chest, Sula's memory carrying the rest of it, a weight now split between paper and person, and somehow lighter for the splitting. Partway down, where the switchbacks widened enough to ride 2 abreast, Sula slowed her horse to match his pace instead of leading ahead the way she had the whole way up. "You've been quiet since we left the fire," she said. "Still working through what your father told me. About Whitfield and Reyes." I noticed. She was quiet a moment, choosing her next words with the same care she chose most things. "You don't have to carry that alone either, Calder. Same as I didn't have to carry my father's memory alone, once you were willing to ride up here with me. Feels different. Yours was grief you'd already made peace with shape of. Mine's grief I didn't even know I owed until 3 days ago. Grief doesn't care how long you've known its shape, only that you're finally willing to hold it instead of setting it down somewhere convenient and pretending it isn't yours." He looked over at her, something in her words landing harder than he expected. "You always this wise? Or is it just for my benefit?" "Mostly for your benefit," she said, and there was warmth enough in it now that he understood she meant the answer to be at least half a joke. "You needed it more than most people I've met. Grateful, all the same. You should be." But she was almost smiling when she said it, and something about the easy rhythm of the exchange, teasing and true at once, felt like further proof of how far the ground between them had shifted since that first wary morning in the wash. Neither one of them knew yet that Voss had already stopped waiting. They had 2 days before he arrived at their door, and neither one of them wasted an hour of it. Holt spent the first morning back walking every inch of the ranch's perimeter, with a scout's eye instead of a rancher's, marking in his head which approaches offered cover, which offered none, which stretch of fence a man could hold with a rifle, and which stretch would need to be abandoned the moment real trouble arrived. He moved the horses to the corral nearest the cabin, close enough to reach fast if things went bad quick. He checked every round of ammunition he owned twice, and then, unsatisfied, a third time. Sula spent that same morning teaching him what she could of what her people knew about defending a fixed position against a larger force, patient the way she'd been patient with the sinew cord and the rabbit tracks, correcting his instincts where they leaned too heavy toward standing ground and not heavy enough toward using the land itself as a weapon. "You want to fight from strength," she told him, crouched beside him at the edge of the yard, sketching the ranch's layout in the dirt with a stick. "That's a soldier's habit. Standing tall, meeting force with straight on. But a smaller number against a larger one doesn't win by standing tall. It wins by making the larger number waste itself finding you." Ezra Whitlock rode out that same afternoon, unannounced, reining up at the fence line with the particular urgency of a man who'd heard something worth the ride. "Figured you ought to know," Ezra said, not bothering to dismount, eyes moving over the half-built barricade along the porch with open concern. Words traveling fast about what happened at Dunmore's office. Voss lost face bad over that ledger getting found, and worse over that ranch fight everybody's already talking about clear to Prescott. Man like that doesn't absorb a public loss like that quiet. Calder. He's going to want it back, and want it back big. Figured as much. He's also been asking around about the territorial judge's schedule. Trying to get to him first, best I can tell, before you get the chance to lay your evidence out proper. Ezra's gaze flicked to Sula, then back to Holt, something careful in it. "You've got maybe a handful of days before that udge rides through. Whatever's coming, it's coming fast now. Then we'll be ready fast." Ezra studied the two of them a long moment, the reedied yard, the barricade, the particular set of two people who'd clearly stopped waiting for trouble to arrive on its own terms. "You know, son, when you rode out to my place asking for rope and nails, I figured you for a man in over his head. Still might be. But I'll say this, you're not drowning quiet about it, and that's more than most men manage. Best I can offer. Best most folks ever manage, in my experience." Ezra tipped his hat, turned his horse. "I'll keep my ears open. You need runners sent. My boy can ride faster than anybody else in this territory. Don't be too proud to ask." He rode off without waiting for thanks, and Holt watched him go, grateful in a way he didn't have easy words for. The particular gratitude of learning, slow and late, that he'd never been quite as alone in this fight as the last 2 weeks had made him feel. "No," Sula said. Once Ezra had gone, returning to the map scratched in the dirt like the interruption had simply been a pause in a longer thought. "He'll come back angrier and better prepared, which means we can't be in the same position twice." They spent the second day making certain of it, moving the water barrels to where a man could reach them without crossing open ground, stacking what lumber remained from the barn into a rough barricade along the porch's weakest angle, and Sula showed him how to lay a scattering of loose stone along the northern approach, where the ground would announce anybody trying to cross it quiet in the dark. That evening, work mostly finished, they sat together on the porch step in the gathering dark, the ranch around them readied as well as two people, and 2 days could manage. "You're different than you were the first morning I found you," Holt said, watching her check her rifle one more time out of habit more than necessity. "How so?" "That morning you were surviving. Everything about you was pointed at just getting through the next hour. Now he searched for the word commanding. Like you've stepped back into something you used to be, before all this started." She considered that, turning the rifle over once in her hands before setting it aside. "I was a warrior before I was anything else, Calder. Before I was frightened, before I was hiding, before any of what Voss and this territory turned me into for the sake of their own convenience. This," she gestured at the barricade, the stones, the reedied yard. "This is just remembering what I already knew how to be. Suits you. Careful, Calder. Might start thinking you mean that as more than a compliment on my tactics." "Might," he allowed, and something passed between them in the dark, warm and unhurried, neither one rushing to name it, both of them content for the moment, to simply let it sit there unclaimed between two people readying themselves for whatever the next dawn might bring. The riders came at dusk 2 days later. Holt heard them before he saw them, that particular rumble of many hooves moving with purpose instead of pace, and by the time he made it to the porch with his rifle already in hand, He could count better than 20 men strung out across the flat approach to the ranch, Voss himself at the center of them, unhurried as ever, like a man arriving for a business meeting instead of a siege. Calder, Voss's voice carried easy across the open ground, confident in a way that made Holt's skin crawl. Last chance to hand her over quiet. Save us both a mess. Already gave you my answer in town, Voss. Sheriff's dead now, no law left to hide behind. Wasn't hiding behind him the first time. Not starting now, Voss's jaw tightened, just visible even at this distance. Then we do this the hard way. Sula appeared at Holt's shoulder, rifle already in her own hands. Steady, unafraid. The same expression she'd worn kneeling in that town square 9 days back, except now there was no rope, no crowd. Nothing standing me between her and the fight, except the choice to make it. You don't have to do this, Holt said, just for her. Neither do you. She checked her rifle without looking away from the riders. We're past the point of should, Calder. Only point left is together or apart. Together, then. Together. The first shots came fast. Chaos breaking loose across the yard in a rush of gunfire, and shouting and dust kicked up gold in the last light. Holt dropped behind the porch rail, returning fire with the flat, economical precision of a man who'd done this before in worse country against worse odds. Sula fought beside him like something out of legend. Every shot deliberate, every movement controlled, no wasted motion. The fear he might have expected simply absent, burned away somewhere over 7 years of learning exactly what it cost to survive. Because this wasn't new to her. This was the oldest fight there was. A rider broke from the main line, cutting hard toward the barn, torch already lit in his free hand, and Holtz swung his rifle without fully thinking the motion through, dropped him before the torch ever found the wood. The man's horse shied off riderless into the dark, and somewhere in that same breath Holt understood there'd be no going back from tonight, regardless of how it ended. Minutes stretched long and terrible. A bullet took a chunk out of the porch post inches from Holt's head. He staggered back a step, ears ringing, and didn't see the second rider coming up fast along the side of the cabin until Sula's rifle cracked beside his ear, and the man went down hard in the dirt, not 6 feet from where Holt's own back had been turned. Careful, she said. Breathless. Furious. I didn't drag you this far to bury you in your own yard. Noted. He found his footing again. Same goes. He got the chance to make good on it minutes later, when Sula's rifle jammed at the worst possible moment, a rider bearing down on her position fast, and Holt was already moving before he'd fully registered the danger, putting himself between her and the charging horse, twice, dropping the rider 6 feet short of where she knelt, still working the jam free. She looked up at him, breathing hard, something fierce and grateful tangled together in her face. Even now, told you. Same goes. Another bullet grazed his shoulder, hot and sharp, and he barely registered it. Adrenaline burning everything down to the single narrow task of keeping them both breathing. 3 riders broke off together, working around toward the loose stone Sula had scattered along the northern approach 2 days back, and Holt watched with grim satisfaction as their horses balked and stumbled at the sudden noise underfoot, throwing the riders aim wide, buying precious seconds that Sula used to drop the lead horse's rider clean before the man ever found his footing again. That was mine, she said, reloading fast, something almost fierce and pleased in it despite everything. Wasn't arguing. The barricade held longer than Holt had dared hope, the stacked barn lumber taking hit after hit without giving way. But the numbers were still what they were, more than 20 against 2. And Holt could feel the arithmetic of it starting to turn against them, no matter how well they'd prepared. A rider got close enough on the west side that Holt heard the man's horse breathing before he heard the gunshot, close enough that he had to trust his aim faster than he trusted anything else in that entire fight, and the shot landed true only because 7 years of scouting had taught his hands to work faster than his fear ever managed to. Calder. Sula's voice urgent, close. We can't hold this line much longer, too many of them. I know. Then what? He didn't have an answer. That was the terrifying truth of it. Crouched behind a porch rail with the barn already burning somewhere behind them. Out of easy answers. Out of easy time. Except something was changing at the edges of the fight. Voss's men, the ones circling wide toward the north pasture, had gone suddenly quiet, their advance stuttering, and Holt risked a glance over the rail to see why. Riders. New ones. Coming down off the ridge in a wide, deliberate arc, dozens of them, moving with the kind of coordinated calm that only comes from people who've trained for exactly this moment their whole lives. Sula's breath caught beside him. Taji, she breathed, because that was who led them, out in front, unmistakable, even at distance, and behind him a full line of riders spreading out to encircle the whole fight instead of joining it. A silent wall, closing slow and certain, around Voss's men from every direction but the one that led back toward town. The smoke, Sula said. 2 nights back, before we rode home from the high camp. I lit it without telling you. In case what? In case exactly this. Voss's confidence, so unshakable minutes before, cracked wide open the moment he understood what was closing around him. His men outnumbered now, and surrounded on 3 sides by a force that hadn't fired a single shot yet and clearly didn't need to in order to make its point, began pulling back without waiting for the order. This isn't finished, Calder, Voss shouted across the widening gap, fury and fear tangled together in his voice for the first time since Holt had met him. You understand that? This isn't finished. Figured as much, Holt called back. Doesn't mean you're winning it. Voss wheeled his horse and rode, his men falling back around him in a ragged, humiliated retreat, and the circle of Apache riders let them go without pursuit, without a single shot fired, the message already delivered plainer than any bullet could have made it. Taji rode forward alone once the dust had settled, reining up in front of the porch where Holt and Sula stood, breathing hard, blood and dust and smoke thick in the air around them. A younger rider, sharp-eyed, held back a length behind him, watching Holt with open curiosity more than suspicion. Someone Taji introduced simply as his sister's son once the tension of the moment had eased enough to allow for names at all. Taji looked at Holt a long moment, measuring, weighing something the same way Great Elk had weighed him 2 nights back in the high country. You are the one who lowered the rifle, Taji said finally. Not a question. I am. And the one who rode 9 days later into the mountains with my cousin to find the truth instead of leaving it buried. That too. Taji's expression didn't soften exactly, but something in it shifted. The same complicated movement Holt had watched cross Great Elk's face 2 nights before, grief and calculation, and something almost like respect all moving through at once, and finally settling somewhere Holt could work with. Great Elk sent word ahead of us, Taji said. Told us what you told him, what the sheriff's paper says, what Voss has been trying to bury under a railroad line. Then, you know what's coming next, Holt said. A federal judge. A courtroom fight if we're lucky enough to get one before Voss finds another way to silence somebody. We know. Taji looked to Sula, something quieter passing between cousins, who'd clearly carried this fight together long before Holt ever rode into it. And we will not let this be decided only with rifles, if it can be decided with truth instead. But if it comes to rifles again, his gaze moved back to Holt, steady, final. We will be closer this time than a signal fire 2 nights' ride away. Behind them, the barn still smoldered low against the darkening sky, and somewhere out past the ridge Garrett Voss was already riding hard for town, already reworking his plan, already deciding that if he couldn't win this with fire and rifles, he'd find some other way to burn it all down instead. The younger rider Taji had introduced lingered a moment after the others had begun moving off, studying the scorched barn and the barricade Sula had helped design with open curiosity. You built this in 2 days, he said to Holt, something like respect in the observation. My uncle said you would be ready. Did not say you would be ready this well. Had good teaching, Holt said, glancing at Sula. She is good at most things she sets her mind to. The young man said, matter of fact, the particular pride of a relative stating an obvious fact rather than offering flattery. Always has been. Glad to finally see somebody outside the family keep up with her. He rode off after the others before Holt could find a reply, and Sula, overhearing the tail end of it, allowed herself something close to an embarrassed laugh. Family's got opinions, I see, Holt said. Family's got a lot of opinions. Most of them accurate, unfortunately. Before the adrenaline fully drained from either of them, Sula insisted on tending Holt's shoulder properly, refusing to let him wave it off as nothing the way he tried to. Sit, she said, already fetching what remained of the clean cloth from inside. You did the same for me, first night we met. Only fair. Wasn't keeping score, I am. He sat. She worked the wound clean with the same careful, unhurried competence he remembered from that first night. And something about the role, reversed now, her hand steady on his shoulder instead of his on her leg, felt like its own kind of marker past. proof of how far they'd traveled together since that wary first evening at the cabin. "You've gotten better at this," he said, watching her work. "Had more practice than I'd like admitting to, this past 2 weeks." "Fair point." She tied off the bandage, checked it once, satisfied, and sat back on her heels, studying him a moment in the firelight from what remained of the barn's smoldering ruin. "We're going to keep needing to do this for each other," she said. "Aren't we, however this ends?" "Reckon so. I find I don't mind that as much as I probably should." "Neither do I," he admitted, and something passed between them in that moment, quiet and certain, neither one needing to name it fully for both of them to understand exactly what it was. Holt sat down heavy on the porch step once the last of the riders had gone quiet in the distance, the strength going out of his legs all at once, the way it always did after, never during. Sula sat beside him, close enough that her shoulder pressed warm against his, both of them too tired and too wired at once to do anything but sit there and breathe. "You're bleeding," she said, nodding at his shoulder. "You're bleeding too." He nodded at the graze along her forearm, already crusting dark. "Guess we matched then." It wasn't much of a joke. Landed like one anyway, the two of them almost laughing in the particular punch-drunk way people laugh after surviving something that could easily have gone the other direction. And for one long moment, neither of them said anything else at all, just sat there together in the settling dark, watching the barn smoke thin into the stars. For tonight, at least, they were both still standing, Holt said finally, half to himself. "That's got to count for something." "It does." Sula leaned her head, just slightly, against his shoulder, careful of the wound there. "Doesn't mean the hardest part's behind us." "No," he agreed. "Reckon it's still coming, in a courtroom maybe, in whatever twisted shape Voss decides to give it next. Then we meet it the same way we met tonight. Together." "Together," she said again, and this time the word carried something new in it, something that hadn't quite been there the first time she'd said it, back before the shooting started. Not just an agreement to fight side by side. Something steadier than that. Something that sounded, if a person listened close enough, almost like a promise. The barn was still smoking at first light. Holt stood over the ruin of it a long moment, hat off, the way a man stands over something he's not ready to call finished grieving yet. Because a barn was just wood. He knew that. Could rebuild wood. What worried him was everything Voss still had left to burn. That wasn't made of timber. Sula found him there, a bandage wound tight around her forearm. Where the graze from the night before had finally stopped bleeding, she didn't say anything for a moment. Just stood beside him, looking at the same black ruin, both of them doing the same silent math. "He'll go to the judge first," she said finally. "Before I figured that too. And he'll have a story ready. He's had days to build one. So we ride faster than his story does." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "You say that like speed's ever beaten a man with money before?" "Hasn't yet." Holt turned from the barn, already moving toward the horses. Might be time it started. Before they left, Holt walked the yard once more, checking on what the night had cost them. Two of the horses had taken minor grazes and would mend fine. The barricade Sula had helped him build had done its work, and then some, splintered but standing, testament to 2 days of careful preparation that had likely saved both their lives. Taji's people had already ridden back toward the high country to see to their own wounded, none seriously hurt, a mercy Holt didn't take for granted given how the night could easily have gone. Great Elk had stayed behind at first light, waiting by the corral with a small bundle wrapped in cloth, and when Holt approached he held it out without ceremony. "For the journey," the old man said. "Whatever happens in that town today, you should not walk into it carrying only your own strength." Holt unwrapped it enough to see a strip of woven cord, similar to the kind he'd watched Sula work by the fire so many evenings now, dyed dark red at intervals along its length. "It won't stop a bullet," Great Elk said. Something almost wry in it. "But it will remind you, if your hands start shaking in that room, that more people than you know are standing behind whatever you choose to say." Holt tied it around his wrist without a word, 'cause some gifts didn't need thanking out loud to be understood, and Great Elk nodded once, satisfied, before turning back toward the trail north. Sula, watching from the porch, caught her father's eye a moment before he left, and something passed between them, quiet, complete, the particular understanding that had rebuilt itself between them these past days without either needing to force it faster than it wanted to grow. "He gave you the traveling cord," she said. Once, Great Elk had gone. "That's not a small thing, Calder." He hasn't given that to anybody since before the canyon. Didn't realize it was that kind of gift. Most of the important ones don't announce themselves as such. You're learning that plenty by now, I'd think. He looked down at the cord-tied plane around his wrist, understanding finally the full weight of what had just been offered him. Reckon I am. They rode in with the sun still low, the copy of the treaty folded against Holt's chest, same as it had ridden for days now. Sula beside him, Great Elk and Taji, and three more from the high camp following a half-length back, close enough to matter, far enough not to look like an army riding on a town that had already learned to fear the sight of too many riders coming at once. They passed the Colson place on the way in, a small spread Holt had known distantly for years, and found it burned out same as his own barn had nearly been, fence line down, the family's few head of cattle scattered or gone. An old dog sat watching the road from what was left of the porch, and nobody had come yet to claim the place back from the ash. Holt reined up long enough to call out, and a woman emerged from what remained of a lean-to out back, thin, exhausted, a young boy clinging close to her skirts. Martha Colson, he remembered now, though he'd exchanged maybe a dozen words with her in as many years. Mrs. Colson. Holt tipped his hat. Careful. You and the boy all right? Alive, she said, flat. The particular flatness of somebody who'd used up every other emotion already and had nothing left but the bare fact of survival to report. Can't say much more than that. Voss's men came through 8 days back. Told my husband the land was worth more to the railroad empty than worked, and they'd be glad to help make it empty if he didn't see reason first. Where's your husband now? Something flickered across her face. Old grief layered thin over fresher fear. Rode to Prescott to file a complaint nobody was ever going to hear. Hasn't come back yet. I don't know if that means he's still trying or if it means something worse. Holt felt something cold settle in his chest at that. One more name to add to the ledger of what Voss's ambition had cost this territory. We're riding to see a federal judge right now, ma'am. About exactly this kind of business. You'd be within your rights to come tell him your own story, if you're willing. Martha Colson studied him a long moment, weighing the offer against whatever exhaustion had taught her these past 8 days, about trusting strangers with badges of any kind, official or otherwise. I'll come, she said finally. Somebody ought to say it plain. What that man's been doing to people who never did him a lick of harm. She rode with them the rest of the way. The boy settled quiet in front of her, and by the time they reached Ashford Hollow, Holt understood the case against Garrett Voss had grown considerably larger than one hidden treaty and one dead sheriff. His men did more than burn a barn to make their point, Sula said quietly, watching Martha Colson ride ahead of them with the boy, both of them still catching their breath from the fright of the past 8 days. Not a question, just a fact settling heavier the longer she looked at it. No, they didn't. Holt kept his voice low, careful the words wouldn't carry to mother or son riding just ahead. Colson wasn't sheltering anybody, wasn't fighting Voss on anything at all. Man just had land Voss wanted cheap, and a fire turned out to be a persuasive enough offer. How many more of these are out there? More than I want to count. Ezra told me 3 valleys, at least, where Voss has been working the same kind of pressure. This is what that number looks like up close. Nobody spoke for a while after that. There wasn't much left to say that the burned fence line behind them hadn't already said plainer than words could manage. Holt understood, riding on, that whatever happened in front of the judge today wasn't only going to decide Sousa's fate, or his own ranch, or even the one valley the treaty named. It was going to decide whether a man with enough money could keep doing this to anybody who stood too close to something he wanted, indefinitely, until somebody with enough evidence and enough stubbornness finally made him stop. Ashford Hollow looked different riding in the second time. Same street. Same buildings leaning the same tired way against a sky that never once softened for anybody. Except the air had changed, gone thick with something Holt recognized from every hard season he'd lived through on this land, the particular tension of a town that's already decided which story it wants to believe before the truths had a chance to walk through the door. People stopped what they were doing to watch them ride in. Nobody called out this time. Nobody reached for rope either, which Holt supposed counted as progress of a kind, thin as it was. The territorial judge had set up at the church, the only building in town, large enough to hold a crowd and solemn enough to make folks behave while they were in it. Judge Ellery Vane, According to the notice, nailed outside, a narrow, unhurried man in a black coat who looked like he'd spent more years reading law than living it. The kind of careful expression that gave nothing away until it had already decided everything. And standing beside him, close, comfortable, already friends catching up, Garrett Voss. Holt's stomach dropped a full floor. "He beat us here," Sula said. Quiet, flat, the voice of somebody watching a plan collapse in real time and refusing to let the collapse show on her face. "Figured that too," Holt said again, though this time the words came out heavier than before. Voss saw them dismount and smiled, actually smiled, easy and unbothered, a man who'd already laid his cards and knew exactly what hand he was holding. "Calder," he called across the street. "Judge Vane and I were just discussing you." "Bet you were." Told him about the raid on my property. The Apache riders. The fires. Voss's voice carried, pitched for the growing crowd now gathering at a careful distance, the same way a crowd had gathered 9 days back for a hanging that never happened. Told him how you've been harboring hostiles on your land. Arming them, some might say. Inciting. That's not... Judge Vane's heard plenty already, Calder. Voss's smile didn't waver. Question now is whether he'll hear you out before or after he's decided you're the reason this territory is about to catch fire. Judge Vane's expression remained unreadable throughout, the careful stillness of a man who'd clearly presided over enough frontier disputes to know better than to commit his face to either side before the facts finished arriving. "Mr. Calder," the judge said, even, measured. "Mr. Voss has laid out a serious accusation, conspiracy against settlers. Harboring an armed party responsible for last night's disturbance at your property, which 3 witnesses have already described to me as an unprovoked attack. I'll admit, given what's been presented to me so far, the account doesn't favor you. Unprovoked." Holt felt something hot rise up his throat. "He rode 20 men onto my land with rifles drawn. That's not what my witnesses say. Your witnesses work for him." Voss's smile thinned. Just slightly, the first crack Holt had managed to put in it since arriving. "Careful, Calder. Slander's its own kind of crime out here." For a moment, standing there in that street with the judge's face, still unconvinced, and Voss's men, scattered watchful through the crowd, Holt felt the whole thing tilting the wrong direction, felt exactly how easily a story built first could outrun a truth that arrived second. He'd seen this before, too, in a different uniform. Watched careful lies outpace slower honesty more times than he cared to remember. "So is murder," Holt said. The word landed hard across the gathered crowd, a ripple of murmurs moving through it, and Judge Vane's careful stillness finally cracked into something sharper, more attentive. "Explain that statement," the judge said. Holt reached into his coat, pulled out the folded paper he'd carried against his own chest since Dunmore's confession, worn soft now at every crease from handling, and held it out. "Sheriff Dunmore didn't die from a spooked horse," he said. "He died because he was about to hand this over to whoever came through with real authority, before Voss's men made sure he never got the chance." Judge Vane took the paper, read it in silence, slow, his expression tightening line by line as the words settled in. "This is a copy of a federal treaty," the judge said, finally. "It is. Dated the Silver Bend Valley, as land held in trust for the Chiricahua Apache. It does." Voss's easy confidence had gone rigid now, his jaw set hard, eyes cutting toward Holt with something considerably less friendly than the smile he'd worn moments before. "That's forged," Voss said. "Too fast. Fabricated. This man's clearly been coached by the very people he's been harboring. Then where's the original, Voss?" Holt's voice cut clean through the protest. "Because there was one. Hidden 7 years. Undisturbed. Until your men finally dug up the right hole after weeks of tearing apart every old camp in this territory looking for it. Ask the Coulsons what a Voss visit looks like, when a man's land is worth more to you empty than occupied." A murmur went through the crowd at the Coulson name, several faces turning grim, and Martha Coulson herself stepped forward from where she'd been standing quiet near the back, her boy's hand still gripped tight in her own. "He's telling the truth, Your Honor," she said, voice unsteady but clear enough to carry. "Voss's men burned us out 8 days back. Told my husband plain the land was worth more empty than worked. He's been in Prescott since, trying to file a complaint nobody wanted to hear before today." A few nodded, slow like a piece they'd been holding separate, had just clicked into a larger picture. Somewhere near the front, Ferris from the feed store shifted his weight, uncomfortable, and Holt caught the man's eye for half a second, saw something flicker there, that hadn't been in his face 9 days back outside the sheriff's office. "I don't know what you're talking about," Voss said. But the words had lost their smoothness, coming out tight now, rehearsed and failing under pressure, for the first time since Holt had known him. "I think you do," Holt said. "I think when Dunmore's conscience finally caught up with 2 years of your money, you made certain he didn't live long enough to hand over what he'd copied in secret." "Speculation," Voss snapped. "Then let's hear from somebody who isn't speculating." Holt turned toward the edge of the crowd, where Sula had been standing quiet through the whole exchange, and beside her walked forward now with the slow, deliberate dignity of a man who'd waited 7 years for a moment exactly like this one great elk. Taji flanked him on the other side, and behind them, at a respectful distance, the handful more from the high camp, come down at last to stand in the open instead of hidden in rock. The crowd's murmur rose sharp at the sight of them. Judge Vane raised a hand, quieting it, his attention now fully, unmistakably fixed on the old man approaching. "Your Honor," Great Elk said, his English careful, deliberate, every word chosen with the weight of 7 years behind it. "I was alive the year that treaty was signed. I watched the lines drawn on the map myself, watched the federal agent's own hand mark this valley as ours to keep. I have carried every boundary of it in my memory since, in case paper ever failed to survive what men like him." A slow nod toward Voss were willing to do to make it disappear. "You can recite these boundaries," Judge Vane said. "Not quite a question. More like a man testing the weight of a claim before he decided to believe it. I can recite them exactly as they were spoken to my people the day they were signed. And I am not the only one alive who can. There are 11 of us, Your Honor. 11 who survived a morning 7 years ago, when soldiers rode into our camp searching for exactly the land this man is now trying to steal a second time." Great Elk recited them then, slow, unhurried, every ridge line and creek bend named in an order that matched Dunmore's copied page word for word as Judge Vane followed along, finger moving down the paper, and somewhere in the middle of it, the crowd's murmuring died away entirely, replaced by the particular silence of people listening to something they hadn't expected to find themselves believing. Voss's composure finally broke. "This is absurd," he said, louder now, turning to the crowd instead of the judge, looking for the old comfortable ground of public opinion that had always tilted his way before. "You're going to take the word of savages over the word of a man who's built half this territory with his own 2 hands. I'm going to take the word of sworn testimony over a man who's already been caught lying twice in the last 5 minutes," Judge Vane said sharp now, any pretense of neutrality gone from his voice entirely. "Mr. Voss, I'd advise you to consider very carefully what you say next." Near the front of the crowd, Ferris finally spoke, voice cracking with the effort of saying it out loud in front of everyone he'd known his whole life. "He's been paying half the county to look the other way, Your Honor. I've seen the grazing leases." Nobody wanted to say it plain. A ripple moved through the crowd at that, something shifting. The old fear of Voss's money finally loosening its grip, now that one voice had broken first and nothing terrible had happened to him for saying it. Somewhere behind Ferris, the Kessler boy nodded along, quiet but visible, and one by one a few more faces in that crowd stopped looking like people waiting to see which way was safe to lean, and started looking, for the first time in longer than Holt could remember, like people simply listening. The crowd had gone dead quiet again after, because something had shifted in the air of that street, palpable, the same kind of shift Holt felt from the moment he'd lowered his rifle 9 days back. The sensation of a town's collective certainty cracking open around a truth it hadn't been ready to hold. Voss felt it too. Holt watched it land on him, watched the calculation move fast behind his eyes, a man used to controlling every room he ever walked into, suddenly understanding this particular room had slipped entirely out of his grip, which is when he went for the gun at his hip. It happened fast. Faster than thought, the way real danger always does. No room for anybody to plan a reaction. Only room to have one. Voss's hand closed around the grip. The crowd scattered back with a collective gasp, Judge Vane stumbling a step out of the direct line, and for one suspended half-second Holt saw exactly where the barrel was swinging, not toward him. Toward Sula, toward the one person whose testimony, whose memory, whose simple continued existence was the last thing standing between Voss and whatever desperate escape he still imagined was possible. Holt moved without deciding to move. He crossed the distance in 3 strides, close enough now that when Voss's gun cleared its holster fully, Holt's hand was already there, already closing hard around the other man's wrist, wrenching the barrel up and wide a half-second before it could ever level toward her. The gun fired into open sky, harmless, loud. And then Holt had him, both of them grappling in the dust of the same street where 9 days back he'd knelt with a different weapon and made a different choice. And this time there was no crowd calling for blood, only a stunned, breathless silence as Holt twisted the gun free from Voss's grip and drove him down hard into the dirt. He had every reason, right there in that moment, to end it the way half this territory probably expected a man like him to end it. He didn't, held Voss pinned instead. Gun cleared, discarded, kicked well out of reach. Voss struggling weak and furious beneath him, and Holt leaned down close, voice low enough that only the two of them heard it. "Not going to make the same mistake with you that you keep trying to make with everybody else," Holt said. "You don't get to decide who lives and who doesn't, not anymore." Then he looked up, found Judge Vane's eyes across the settling dust. "Your call now, Your Honor," Holt said. "Not mine." It took the better part of an hour to settle the street back into something resembling order. Voss, disarmed and bound now by two of the judge's own deputized men, sat silent and pale against the church steps, the fight gone entirely out of him, replaced by the particular hollow look of a man watching every plan he'd ever built collapse in the space of a single morning. Judge Vane called Sula forward first among the remaining witnesses, and she stepped up without hesitations, spine straight, chin level, the same steady bearing she'd carried, kneeling in that same street 9 days back under a rifle instead of a judge's careful attention. "Tell the court what happened the day Mr. Calder found you," Judge Vane said. "I was running from Voss's men," she said, voice clear enough to carry the length of the street. "Wounded, hiding in a wash on his land. He could have turned me over to the sheriff without a second thought and lost nothing for it. Instead, he tended my wound himself, and when this town wanted me dead in its street 9 days later, he chose to stand against every person he'd ever called neighbor rather than let it happen. And the canyon he's spoken of. You can confirm his account of it. I was there. I was one of the 11 who survived it, because of a choice this man made when he had every reason not to make it. I've carried his face in my 7 years, Your Honor. Not as an enemy. As the reason I'm alive to stand in front of you today." Judge Vane studied her a long moment, something in his careful expression shifting further still. "That will be all. Thank you." She stepped back beside Holt, and he caught her hand briefly, quick, grateful, before the next witness was called. Great Elk's recitation of the treaty boundaries followed, matched against Dunmore's copied page line by line without a single discrepancy. Even Doc Sutter, called forward to describe the wound on Dunmore's skull that no spooked horse had ever caused. Judge Vane called a brief pause before the final testimony, giving the crowd a moment to settle and, Holt suspected, giving himself a moment to organize the considerable weight of what he'd already heard. The waiting stretched longer than it needed to. The whole town gathered loose around the church steps, in a silence thick with everything still undecided. Holt found Sula near the edge of the crowd, apart from the others, her hand still faintly trembling from adrenaline that hadn't fully left her system since the night before. "He could still rule against us," she said quiet, not quite a question. "He could. Does that frighten you?" Holt considered the honest answer before giving it. "Less than it would have 2 weeks ago. Whatever he decides once I've said my piece, I already know what I did was right. That's not nothing, even if it doesn't win the day. That's a scout's answer, not a hopeful one. Didn't say I wasn't hopeful too." He glanced toward the church doors. "Just learned a long time back not to let hope do all the standing on its own. Needs something steadier holding it up." She studied him a moment, something warm moving behind the exhaustion in her eyes. "And what's holding yours up today, Calder?" "You are. Has been for a while now, if I'm being honest about it." She didn't have a ready answer for that, but she didn't need one. The two of them standing close together in that uncertain quiet before Judge Vane called the proceedings back to order. Holt gave his own account last. All of it. The canyon 7 years back, the lie he'd told his column. The 2 soldiers he hadn't known until 3 days ago had paid for that lie with their own lives. He didn't soften it. Didn't dress it up as anything other than what it was, a choice made in fear, carrying a cost that had taken him 7 years and a dead sheriff's hidden letter to finally understand whole. The crowd listened in a silence that had nothing to do with judgment anymore, and everything to do with, simply finally, hearing a true thing said plain. When Holt finished, Judge Vane sat quiet a long moment, hands folded, the church steps behind him gone gold with early afternoon light. "Mr. Calder," the judge said finally, "you understand you've just confessed to falsifying a military report." "I do. That's not a small thing to admit in open court. Neither's watching a woman kneel in the dirt because I was too much of a coward the first time to say anything at all." Something in the judge's expression eased, just slightly, the careful neutrality giving way to something almost like respect. "The federal government does not take kindly to falsified reports, Mr. Calder. But this court is not currently in the business of relitigating a war 7 years finished, especially not when the man confessing has spent the last 2 weeks risking everything he owns to correct a far larger wrong." Vane's gaze shifted to Voss, slumped and silent on the steps. "This court is, however, very much in the business of a forged land title, a murdered sheriff, an armed assault on private property, and I expect, once a proper accounting is done, the ruin of at least one more family's land, besides the one named in this treaty, carried out on the orders of a man who has spent considerable effort this morning, proving himself unworthy of any benefit of the doubt." He rose. The whole street seemed to rise with him, breath held. "By the authority vested in me by the territorial government of Arizona," Judge Vane said, "I hereby uphold the Treaty of 1872 in full. The Silver Bend Valley is confirmed as land held in trust for the Chiricahua Apache, as originally and lawfully recorded. Any deed, lease, or agreement executed since in contradiction of this treaty, including any pending arrangement with railroad interests, is void, effective immediately." A murmur ran through the crowd, not hostile this time. Something closer to a held breath finally released. "Garrett Voss," the judge continued, turning now toward the man sitting broken on the steps, "you are hereby charged with forgery, conspiracy, incitement to violence, and pending full investigation the murder of Sheriff Elias Dunmore. You will be held for transport to Territorial Court in Prescott." Voss said nothing, didn't look up. Whatever words he might have once found for a room, he had none left for this one. The crowd didn't disperse right away. For a long moment everybody simply stood there, absorbing the size of what had just happened, and then slowly, the street began to move again, people finding their way back to ordinary motion, the way a held breath finally releases. Sula found Holt's hand amid the settling crowd, gripping it tight, and neither of them said anything for a moment, both too full of everything at once to trust words with the size of it. Taji, standing near enough to have caught the moment, allowed himself something closer to a genuine smile than Holt had yet seen from the man. "My cousin chose well," he said, glancing at Sula, when she decided which rancher's fence line to collapse against 7 days back. "Wasn't much choosing in it," Sula said, though something warm colored her voice despite the protest. "Mostly just luck, and a scout too stubborn to leave a wounded stranger where he found her." "Then it was forward luck," Taji said. "The best kind there is." They took Voss out of Ashford Hollow the following morning, wrists bound, riding between two of the judge's deputized men toward the road to Prescott. A fair number of the town turned out to watch the wagon go, not jeering exactly, just watching. The particular silent accounting of people who'd spent 2 years afraid of a man and were only now, at the very end of it, allowing themselves to fully believe the fear could finally stop. Holt watched from the church steps, Sula beside him, and felt less satisfaction in the sight than he'd expected to. Not sympathy exactly. Just the tired understanding that a man like Voss losing everything didn't undo a single burned homestead, didn't bring Dunmore back, didn't give Great Elk's wife or Sula's 7 lost years back to anyone. Justice, when it finally arrived, always seemed to arrive a size too small for the wound it was meant to answer. "You're not smiling," Sula observed, watching the wagon roll out of sight. "Didn't figure there was much to smile about. Just relief this part's finally done. That's enough, I think. Not every ending needs to feel like winning. Sometimes it's enough that it's simply over." Great Elk found them there a short while later, having stayed in town to see the matter through to its close, and he studied the empty road a long moment before speaking. "I will return to the mountains today," he said. "There is a resettling to plan, and my people have waited 7 years for the chance to do it right." He looked at Holt then, something final and warm in his weathered face. "You have paid a debt today that I did not truly expect to see paid in my lifetime. Scout. I do not say that lightly. Wasn't sure I'd manage it either. Until I did. That is usually how the important debts get paid," Great Elk said. "Not by men who were certain of themselves from the start, but by men who kept walking forward anyway, uncertain, because the alternative was worse than the uncertainty. He extended a hand, an unfamiliar gesture from him, and Holt took it, understanding the weight of what was being offered. Come to the valley when the resettling is done. There will be a place for you there if you want it. For both of you. He left before either of them could find the words to properly answer that, walking north toward the mountains with the same unhurried dignity that had carried him through 7 hard years of hiding, and Holt watched him go until the old man was nothing more than a small dark shape against the pale afternoon hills. The railroad man arrived 2 days later. Holt watched him ride in from the porch of the half-rebuilt barn, watched him find the notice already nailed to the church door, watched his face do the particular math of a man realizing his employer's entire investment had evaporated overnight. He didn't stay in Ashford Hollow long. Wired somewhere east before sundown and rode out the next morning, and that, more than anything, felt to Holt like the final closing door on the whole ugly business. The town took longer to settle than the paperwork did. Ezra Whitlock rode out within the week, grinning wider than Holt had ever seen the old man manage. Words already traveling, Ezra said, swinging down off his horse without waiting for an invitation. 2 of those other valleys I told you about. Folks are already digging through old county records, looking for treaties same as yours. Voss's whole operation's coming apart at every seam he ever stitched together. That's right. You didn't just save one valley, Calder. You cracked open a way of doing business. It's been squeezing this territory dry for years. Judge Vane's already sent word to 2 other circuit judges about what turned up here. Folks are paying attention now who never used to bother looking twice at a land dispute. Holt hadn't considered the ripples might travel that far, hadn't let himself think much past the single fight directly in front of him, and something about hearing it laid out plain by a man who'd known this territory longer than Holt had been alive, settled, a weight in his chest he hadn't fully realized he was still carrying. Didn't set out to fix the whole territory, Ezra. Just wanted to keep one woman from hanging in a street she didn't deserve to die in. Most important fixes usually start that small, Ezra said. Man doesn't set out to change the world, just refuses to look away from the one wrong thing sitting right in front of him. Rest tends to follow if he's stubborn enough about it. He clapped Holt on the shoulder, careful of the healing wound. Proud of you, son. Your mother would have been too, though I expect you already know that. Some folks came around fast, the ones who'd only ever gone along with Voss, because going along was easier than standing apart. Doc Sutter rode out not long after the ruling came down, ostensibly to check the wound on Holt's shoulder one final time, though the visit lasted considerably longer than any wound check required. He sat with them a while on the porch, turning his hat slow in his hands the way a man does when there's something on his mind he hasn't quite decided how to say. Dunmore came to me scared, Sutter admitted finally. That night he asked me to hold his letter. I didn't know then what he'd copied, only that he was frightened enough to trust it to a doctor instead of a lawman, which told me plenty on its own. He looked out over the yard, the rebuilt barn standing fresh and pale against the older timber. Wish I'd pushed him harder that night. Asked more questions. Maybe he'd still be breathing if I had. Don't carry that, Holt said, and meant it more than the words alone could carry. Learned recently there's usually more weight to a thing than the piece a man happens to be holding. Doesn't mean the whole weight's his to bear. Sutter studied him a long moment, something easing in his tired face. That an easy thing to believe, Calder, or a hard one? Hard one. Cost considerably more than easy does. Worth it, though. Sutter nodded slow, set his hat back on his head, and rode off not long after, lighter, Holt thought, than he'd arrived. Ferris was among the first, showing up at the ranch that same week with a wagon of lumber he insisted Holt hadn't ordered and wasn't going to be charged for, muttering something about a debt owed for the pie his own wife had never gotten around to baking properly the year Holt's mother passed, which didn't make a lick of sense as an explanation, and both men understood it wasn't meant to. The barn raising itself happened on a Saturday 2 weeks later, more hands showing up than Holt had any right to expect. Ferris came with lumber and stayed the whole day besides. The Kessler boy showed up before sunrise without being asked, worked steady until the last beam went up, and when Holt tried to thank him, the boy just shrugged and said something about a flash flood. 3 summers back like that settled the matter permanently, which, as far as Holt was concerned, it did. Old Mrs. Praff arrived at midday with more food than any crew that size could reasonably finish, and did not once mention the pie she'd baked years back, though she caught Holt's eye across the yard in a way that told him she remembered it fine. Great Elk's people came too, walking down from the resettled camp at first light, and worked alongside the town crew more easily than anybody in that yard would have believed possible a month earlier. Bosch, missing fingers and all, turned out to have a surer hand with a hammer than half the men twice his size. And by mid-afternoon he and the Kessler boy had fallen into an easy rhythm passing nails back and forth that needed no shared language to work, just the same roofline, the same patient counting of boards. Holt stood back at one point, wiping sweat from his eyes, and watched the whole yard full of people who'd have crossed the street from each other a month back now, working the same wood toward the same purpose, and thought that this more than any ruling handed down from a judge's bench was the truest kind of peace this territory was ever going to manage. Not a treaty, not a verdict, just hands, working together, one plank at a time, because somebody had finally given them a reason to try. Ferris found him there at the edge of the work, both of them catching their breath a moment before the next beam needed raising. "Never thought I'd see this," Ferris admitted, nodding at the mixed crew working the frame together. "Man like me, lived here my whole life. Never once had a real conversation with anybody from the high country. Always just assumed there wasn't much to say. Turns out there was plenty, just needed somebody willing to start the conversation. Turns out it needed somebody willing to get shot at twice over it, you mean?" Ferris huffed something like a laugh. "You could have just handed her over that first morning, called her. Easiest thing in the world. Nobody would have blamed you for it. Not really. Man alone, trying to protect his own patch of dirt. Would have blamed myself, though. That's usually the harder judge to satisfy." Ferris considered that a long moment watching Bosch and the Kessler boy hoist another beam into place without a word passing between them, perfectly in step despite it. Guess that's the difference between a man who does right because folks are watching, and a man who does right because he can't stand living with himself otherwise. Guess it is. Well, Ferris clapped him once on the good shoulder, careful of the healing wound in the other. Glad it was the second kind of man who found her in that wash. Territory could stand a few more of those. He went back to work before Holt could find an answer worth giving, and Holt stood there a moment longer, watching the yard, feeling something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for longer than just these past 2 weeks. Maybe for the whole 7 years before them, too. Word came back from Prescott before the snow set in for good Garrett Voss, convicted on every charge the territorial court brought against him. Sentenced to a term long enough that most folks in Ashford Hollow stopped bothering to count the years remaining on it. Martha Colson's husband, it turned out, had finally found somebody willing to hear his complaint after all. Filed alongside a dozen others from the valleys Ezra had once warned Holt about. Enough testimony piled together that the conviction came down solid and unappealable. Holt read the news in a letter from Judge Vane, brief and businesslike, and felt the same quiet, unglamorous relief he'd felt watching the wagon roll out of town that first morning. Not triumph, just the sense of a debt, finally fully settled. He rode out to Dunmore's grave the week after the ruling, Sula beside him, and stood there a long while with his hat in his hands. "You should have told me sooner," he said. To the dirt, to the marker, to nobody who could answer back. Might have saved yourself. The wind didn't answer either, but something in Holt eased anyway just standing there. The way grief does sometimes when it's finally allowed to be spoken, instead of carried silent. Sula stood quiet beside him a while before finally speaking. "You're angry at him for dying before he could finish making it right." "Some. Mostly just sorry he never let himself believe he could still be the kind of man worth trusting, until it was already too late to prove it to anybody but a folded letter. That's a hard kind of sorry to carry. Most worthwhile kinds are." He set his hat back on, looked at the marker a moment longer. "Reckon he did make it right, in the end, even if he never lived to see it land. Man doesn't get to choose when his good finally catches up to him. Just has to hope it does, eventually, one way or another." Sula's hand found his, quiet, steady, and they stood there together a while longer, before finally turning back toward the horses. From there they rode on together, a half-day further north, to a small military cemetery Holt had avoided for 7 years without ever fully admitting to himself why. Sula didn't say much on that second leg of the ride. Just stayed close, the way she'd learned to, and stood beside him while he knelt in the grass in front of two markers he'd known he'd have to face eventually, and finally said the things he'd owed two dead men for far too long. "I didn't know," he told them. "For 7 years, I didn't know what my choice cost you. Knowing now doesn't undo it. But you're not going to be carried forgotten anymore. That much I can still give you." When he stood, Sula's hand found his. Didn't say anything about it. Didn't need to. That evening, back at the ranch, Holt sat at the table long after dark with paper and ink he rarely had cause to use, working slow through two letters he'd been putting off writing since the moment Great Elk first spoke two names by a mountain fire. One to whatever family Corporal Whitfield had left behind, if any could still be found. One to Private Reyes's people, down near the border. If Holt's memory of the man's old stories about home still served him right. He didn't know, writing them, whether either letter would ever find its way to a living soul who'd remember the names attached. Didn't know if the families would want to hear from the scout, whose choice had set their sons on the road to that final posting. But he wrote them anyway, honest and plain, the same way he'd given his account in that dusty street, no softening, no seeking of forgiveness he wasn't owed, just the truth of what had happened, and the fact that two men's names were not going to go on being carried forgotten. Not by him, not any longer. Sula watched him seal both letters, quiet, and when he finally set down the pen, she covered his hand with her own. "That took something out of you," she said. "I can see it. Needed doing. Doesn't much matter what it took. Most worthwhile things don't come free, Calder. Doesn't mean you shouldn't let yourself feel the cost of them." He let himself feel it, that night, more fully than he had in 7 long years, of carrying half a truth instead of the whole of it, and something in him, some old locked door, finally swung open enough to let a little daylight through. Great Elk and Taji came down from the high country for good that autumn, resettling with the small band of survivors on land that was, for the first time in 7 years, unambiguously theirs to stand on. Holt helped where he was welcome to help, which was more often than he expected, fence posts and water lines, and the slow, patient work of two peoples learning to share a valley instead of fight over it. By early winter, what had started as informal cooperation had grown into something more deliberate. Great Elk and a handful of the town's own steadier voices, Ezra Whitlock among them, and eventually even Ferris, once he'd worked up the nerve to be asked, began meeting regularly to settle water rights and grazing boundaries before disputes could harden into anything resembling what Voss had once exploited so easily. Nobody called it a council, not officially, not yet, but that's what it was, plain as anything. Two histories that had spent 7 years, refusing to look at each other now, sitting at the same table, working out the ordinary business of sharing a valley the way neighbors are supposed to. Sula sat in on those meetings more often than not, her voice carrying real weight in them now. Not because anybody had granted her that weight, but because she'd earned it the hard way. The same way Holt had earned whatever standing he still held in a town that had once called for his blood. Watching her speak plain, and unhurried to a room that would have dismissed her outright a season back, Holt understood he was witnessing something larger than just his own small corner of this territory, settling into peace. He was watching the actual shape of what could still be possible out here. If enough people finally decided the old way of doing things wasn't worth the cost, it kept extracting from everybody who wasn't already rich enough to ignore it. When the first real harvest came in that fall, thin but honest after 2 bad seasons finally breaking, Ferris and the Kesslers, and half the ranchers who'd once stood silent outside the sheriff's office, found their way out to Silver Bend for a gathering nobody had quite planned but everybody somehow understood needed to happen. Long tables set up between the rebuilt barn and the tree line, food from both sides of a divide that had held this territory apart for longer than most of the people there had been alive. Bosch telling his coyote story again to a new set of children who laughed in all the same places Lozen once had. Idahi and Mrs. Praff comparing notes over a cook fire like two women who'd simply been waiting years for a reasonable excuse to finally meet. Sula found him there partway through the evening, 2 plates in hand, and settled beside him on the fence rail, without asking whether he wanted company, the way she'd stopped asking weeks ago, because the answer was always the same anyway. "You're doing that thing again," she said. "Standing at the edge of things instead of in the middle of them. Old habit. Man spends enough years scouting ahead of everybody else. Standing at the edge starts to feel like the only honest place to be. Well, tonight the edge is missing good company. She nodded toward the long tables where Itahai and Mrs. Praff had somehow ended up seated together, deep in what looked like a genuinely heated debate over whose bread recipe held up better in a Dutch oven. "Come sit in the middle, for once, Calder. See how it suits you." He let her pull him toward the tables, and found, sitting there among people who'd have been strangers or enemies to each other a season back, that the middle suited him considerably better than he'd expected it to. Bosch told his coyote story once more for a fresh audience, embellished further with each telling, and Lozen rolled her eyes at the parts she'd clearly heard grow taller with every retelling. The Kessler boy and one of the younger men from the high camp had struck up an argument about horses that showed no sign of resolving itself before winter arrived. Taji sat near Great Elk, quieter than most, watching the whole gathering with an expression Holt was starting to recognize as the closest the man ever came to open contentment. He sat there the rest of that evening, plate mostly forgotten in his lap, watching the whole valley settle into something he wouldn't have believed possible the morning he first heard a wounded horse crashing through the mesquite. Winter came hard that year, the way it always did in this territory, but it came to a ranch better prepared for it than any winter Holt had faced alone. The second room he'd left half-framed for so many years finally got finished before the first real snow. Bosch and the Kessler boy trading off the work between them on quiet afternoons, and Holt still hadn't quite found the words to explain, even to himself, exactly what he'd been building room for all along, until he watched Sula's few belongings settle naturally into it without either of them ever having to discuss the matter directly. Some nights that winter were hard in older ways, too, Sula waking from dreams she didn't always want to describe, dreams that still carried the shape of a canyon and a morning she'd never fully stopped carrying, no matter how much peace the valley eventually found. Holt learned not to press on those mornings, just to be there, quiet, the way she'd once been quiet beside him through his own reckonings. And slowly, through that whole first hard winter, the dreams came less often than they had before. Near the tail end of that winter, mending a fence rail gone loose in the frost, Holt found himself thinking back to a promise he'd made her that first stormy night, back before either of them had understood what they were building toward. "You stay until that leg heals. After that, you're free. My word on it." That evening he brought it up himself, careful, the way a man brings up something he spent months circling without quite landing on. "Your leg healed a long while back," he said. "Meant what I told you that first storm. You're free, Sula. Been free for months now. Whether either of us has said it plain or not." She went still, watching him across the fire, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. "You bringing that up because you want me gone, Calder?" "No." He held her gaze steady. "Bringing it up because I want you here by choice, not by any promise or obligation I might have laid on you back when you had nowhere else to go. Wanted you to know the door's open. Always has been. So whatever you decide from here, it's yours to decide, free and clear." She was quiet a long moment, the fire popping between them the same way it had that first night she'd told him about the canyon. "Then I choose to stay," she said finally, simple, certain, no hesitation in it at all. "Not because I've got nowhere else to go. Because this is where I want to be." Something eased in Holt's chest that he hadn't fully realized was still holding tension, and he reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. "Good," he said. "Because I'm not sure this place makes much sense without you in it anymore." "Careful, Calder. Might start thinking that's a proposal." "Might be," he said, and meant it, and neither of them needed to say anything more than that for the moment to land exactly as full as it deserved to. Spring arrived early that year, generous after 2 lean seasons, and with it came the first real planting Holt had managed on land no longer haunted by the threat of Voss's men riding over the ridge. He and Sula worked the fields together most mornings now, the same easy division of labor that had marked their earliest days at the cabin, except easier now, unhurried, no longer shadowed by the particular wariness that had once colored every task between them. One morning, clearing brush along the boundary between his land and the resettled valley beyond, Holt found an old marker post, half-rotted, that must have stood there since before he'd ever bought the place. He dug it out, replaced it with fresh timber, and on impulse, before setting it back in the ground, carved a single word into the new wood, simple, plain, the way he did most things. Sula found him finishing it that evening, read the word carved there, and didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood looking at it with an expression Holt hadn't seen from her before. something that looked, for the first time since he'd known her, entirely unguarded. Home, she said, finally, testing the word out loud. Seemed the right word for it. Didn't have one before. Figured it was past time it did. She looked at him then, not at the marker, and whatever she saw in his face seemed to settle something in her that had been unsettled a long while. It is, she said, the right word. Exactly right. Some evenings, Sula still walked out to the tree line at dusk. The same old habit from those first wary days at the cabin, standing still and facing the mountains for exactly as long as the light lasted. Except now, more often than not, Holt walked out and stood there with her, not asking what she was watching for, just staying, because some things don't need explaining, they only need company. One evening, months later, she finally told him anyway. My mother used to say the mountains remember everyone who ever stood in front of them, she said. Every promise. Every broken one, too. That a comfort or a warning? She almost smiled, the real kind now, the kind that had grown easier and more frequent with every passing week. Depends which kind of man standing there. Holt looked out at the darkening ridge, at land that had cost so much, and finally seemed to be settling into something like peace. Guess we'll find out which kind I turn out to be, he said. Guess we will. She was quiet a moment, studying the last color draining out of the sky. For what it's worth, Calder, I already know the answer. Have for a while now. That's so. A man who lowers a rifle in front of a crowd that wants him to raise it, who rides into the mountains chasing a stranger's hope instead of his own comfort, who tells the truth about himself in open court, knowing it might cost him everything. She turned to look at him fully. Now, that's not a question anymore. Whatever you tell yourself some evenings, that's just who you already are. He didn't have a ready answer for that, the words landing somewhere deep and unguarded, and after a moment he simply reached over and took her hand. The small carved stone from her mother pressed warm between their palms where she'd taken to carrying it since the high camp. Suppose I should stop asking the question then, he said. Suppose you should. They stood there together until the last light gave out over Silver Bend, two people who'd started as captor and captive on a dusty road that already felt like a lifetime ago. Standing now on the same quiet ground, neither one of them had to guard alone anymore. Ashford Hollow once believed Holt Calder would kill the Apache woman kneeling in its street, watched him raise a rifle, certain of exactly how that morning was going to end. Instead, he put the weapon down and picked up the truth instead, and carried it all the way through fire and grief and a 7-year-old debt he never once tried to run from, once he finally understood its weight. The town remembers that morning differently now, not as the day Calder lost his mind, but as the day he finally found what he'd spent 7 years looking for, without ever quite admitting he was looking at all.